The gunmen hit Ironvale Medical Center at 12:47 in the morning. 6 of them, tactical gear, suppressed weapons, moving like they'd rehearsed it 100 times. Within 90 seconds, 2 federal security agents were dead on the floor. The backup generator had been manually cut, and 43 wounded soldiers were trapped in a combat hospital with no power, no communications, and no way out. Everyone in that building believed they were going to die. Nobody looked twice at the blonde nurse standing near the supply cart in Ward C. She was the one they always joked about. Too soft, too quiet, too inexperienced for a hospital like this. They were wrong about every single thing. If this story has you hooked already, follow my channel so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The drive from the staff parking lot to the employee entrance at Ironvale Medical Center took 4 minutes on a good night, and Mara Voss had made that drive so many times she could do it half asleep. Tonight she was doing exactly that. One hand on the wheel, the other wrapped around a gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the interstate, eyes fixed on the dark Nevada highway ahead. She was 31 years old, and she looked younger in the harsh overhead light of the parking garage. Medium height, lean in a way that read as tired rather than athletic. Hair the color of winter wheat pulled back in a regulation braid. No jewelry except a small scar along the outside of her left hand that she'd had since she was 24 and never explained to anyone. She badged through the entrance at 10:52 p.m., 14 minutes before the start of her shift, and immediately felt the particular tension in the air that every experienced ER nurse learns to read before a single word is spoken. The way people moved faster than necessary, the way conversations stopped a half beat too early when a door opened, the way the charge nurse at the front desk was pretending to look at paperwork while actually watching the bank of monitors above the intake station. Mara. The charge nurse, a compact man named Denton, with 2 decades of floor experience and the permanent expression of someone who'd seen everything and been impressed by nothing, looked up just long enough to hand her a revised patient board. Ward C tonight. We've got a federal intake coming in around midnight. Federal? Marshal escort. 2 additional security personnel I've never seen before. Patient is listed as a John Doe, critical but stable. Denton lowered his voice without changing his expression. The attending on the case is Halbrook. He wanted his own nursing team, but administration overrode him. You're the assignment. Mara looked at the board. He know that yet? He knows. He's not happy. He's never happy. Tonight especially. Denton's eyes flicked toward the end of the hall and back. Just keep your head down. Do your job. Don't give him a reason. She'd been hearing some version of that since her first week at Ironvale. Don't give him a reason. Don't make waves. Don't let him see you sweat. Dr. Philip Halbrook was the kind of surgeon who'd built his reputation on genuine skill and then spent the last decade making sure everyone around him suffered for it. He ran his cases like a private kingdom. His nursing staff turned over every 8 months. 3 formal complaints had been filed against him in the past 2 years. All 3 had been quietly resolved in ways that left the complainants looking for jobs elsewhere, and Halbrook still running Ward C. Mara had been assigned to his ward 6 weeks ago. She hadn't filed a complaint. She also hadn't flinched when he corrected her in front of patients, hadn't risen to it when he described her to a resident as the placeholder they sent me while they find someone qualified, hadn't said a word the morning he'd pulled her from a procedure mid-step and told her to go restock supplies because she was creating more problems than she was solving. She had simply done her job. Her colleagues found this either admirable or unsettling, depending on who you asked. How critical is the John Doe? She asked. Abdominal trauma, possible internal bleeding, secondary lacerations on the arms and chest. He came in through a private contractor. Whoever transported him didn't go through standard channels. The federal agents are edgy. Denton looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. The whole thing feels off. I'll be careful. I know you will. He said it like a statement of fact rather than reassurance, which was the highest form of confidence Denton ever expressed. Ward C Base 7. She changed, gathered her supplies, and walked the corridor toward Ward C with her mind doing the quiet, systematic inventory it always did at the start of a shift: exits, personnel, patient status boards, the particular acoustic signature of a ward at night versus during the day, where sound carried and where it got swallowed. It was a habit she'd had for a long time. She didn't think about why anymore. Ward C at Ironvale Medical Center was a military medical wing, one of 3 in the facility. The patients here were active duty and veterans with injuries that ranged from surgical complications to combat trauma, and the ward had a particular atmosphere that the rest of the hospital didn't. Quieter in some ways, denser in others, the kind of stillness that came from people accustomed to waiting without complaint. The soldiers here had been through things. They didn't talk about it much. Neither did Mara. She liked working this ward for reasons she couldn't have articulated clearly if asked. She felt at home among people who communicated more in silences than sentences, who measured trust slowly and changed their minds about people based on actions rather than words, though the soldiers in Ward C, for the most part, had not extended that trust to her. Voss. The voice came from Bay 3 as she passed, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant named Kellerman, who was 3 weeks post-surgery on a hip replacement following a training injury. He was the ward's self-appointed social director and had opinions about everything. "You're on tonight?" Thought Martinez had this shift. Martinez traded. She checked his IV line without being asked. "How's the pain level?" 4, maybe 5. He watched her work. "Don't let Halbrook give you any grief tonight. Word is he's already in a mood." "When isn't he?" "Fair point." Kellerman grinned, but there was something measuring in it. He'd been friendly enough since she'd arrived on the ward, which was its own form of condescension, the way you might be friendly to a new puppy that hadn't proven itself yet. "Heard we're getting a special guest." "I'm not authorized to discuss incoming patients." "Come on. Federal escort, midnight delivery. That's not nothing." "Kellerman." She met his eyes briefly. "Go to sleep." He laughed. "Yes, nurse." She moved on, running through the rest of the bay checks with the quiet efficiency that had characterized her work since her first week. Thorough, fast, rarely in need of correction, never calling attention to it. The other nurses on the night shift knew her well enough by now to work around her without friction. They liked her well enough. They didn't know her. Dr. Halbrook arrived in Ward C at 11:40, and the temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees. He was 56, lean and gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a severe way 20 years ago and had since calcified into something harder. He wore his authority like a physical object, the way some people wore expensive watches, not because they needed to tell time, but because they wanted you to notice it. 2 residents flanked him. He didn't acknowledge the nursing staff. "Bay 7 is prepped," he said to the room in general. "Yes, doctor," Mara said from the supply station. Halbrook turned and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd found something unexpected in a location where it shouldn't be. "Voss." "Doctor, I requested Pelham for this case." "I understand. Administration made the assignment." "I'm aware of what administration did. I'm expressing my position on it." He studied her for a moment with flat, clinical eyes. "This is a high-priority patient with specific medical complexities. This is not a training exercise. If at any point you find yourself uncertain about a protocol or procedure, you will step back and let someone with appropriate experience handle it. Is that understood?" The 2 residents were looking at the floor. The other nurses had gone very still in the way people do when they want to be invisible. "Understood," Mara said. "Good." He moved toward Bay 7 and then stopped, not turning around. "And if you misplace anything, contaminate anything, or compromise this case in any way, I will have you reassigned to the pediatric outpatient clinic before the sun comes up. That is not a threat. It's a statement of intent." He walked away. Kellerman, from Bay 3, caught her eye and made a face. She looked back at him without expression and went to prepare Bay 7. The John Doe arrived at 12:09 a.m. He came in on a gurney flanked by 4 people, 2 U.S. Marshals in tactical vests, and 2 individuals who wore plain clothes but moved with a precision that had nothing to do with medical escort work. One of the plainclothes individuals, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair, and the kind of stillness that suggested she'd been trained in how to stand in a room without drawing attention, swept the bay before the gurney was brought in. The other positioned himself near the entrance and did not move from it. The patient was male, late 40s, dark complexion, heavily built, but currently diminished by whatever had happened to him. The visible wounds were significant. A deep laceration along his left forearm, additional injuries to his chest that had been roughly dressed in the field, and the abdominal trauma Denton had flagged, which showed in the careful way the transport team had kept him still. His breathing was labored but controlled, and despite the pain evident in his face, his eyes were alert. That was the first thing Mara noticed. The second was that those eyes, the moment the gurney cleared the bay entrance, went immediately to the exits. Not the medical equipment, not the staff, not the overhead lights. The exits. She'd seen that reflex before. She kept her face neutral and moved to his side to begin her assessment. "Sir, my name is Mara. I'll be your nurse tonight. Can you tell me your pain level on a scale of 7, he said. His voice was accented, something Eastern European, flattened by years of work in environments where accents got trained out of you. His eyes moved from the exit to her face. Something flickered there, not recognition exactly, more like assessment. "Okay, we're going to get you stabilized, and then the people in this building." He spoke quietly enough that only she could hear it. "How many entry points?" She paused for just a fraction of a second. Long enough to be real, short enough that no one watching would have caught it. 4 standard, 2 service, she said, equally quiet. "The loading dock on the north side has been offline for maintenance for 2 weeks. That access is blocked. We have security on the main entrance, and the federal escort team is positioned." "That's not enough." His jaw tightened against the pain. "There are people who know I'm here, not from your side." His eyes went to the bay entrance and back. "They will come. You need to tell the security team." "I have told people. For 6 months I have told people." Something bitter and exhausted moved across his face. "Tonight, they put me in a building with 4 exits, and 2 days after the location was confirmed to the Federal Liaison Office." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know who in this hospital I can trust, but you looked at the exits when I came in, before you looked at me." She said nothing. "Who are you?" he asked. "Your nurse," she said, and then, in a tone that carried nothing except basic clinical instruction, "I'm going to take your blood pressure now. Try to stay still." Halbrook arrived and took over the assessment, efficiently cutting Mara to the periphery of the work she'd been doing. She let it happen. She moved to the supply position, restocked what was needed, monitored the secondary lines, made herself invisible in the way that Halbrook preferred, useful but not present enough to acknowledge. But her mind was running on a separate track entirely. She'd heard the briefing when she arrived. Federal intake, marshal escort, John Doe. What she hadn't been told, and what nobody on the medical staff seemed to understand, was the specific geometry of what they'd been handed. A protected intelligence asset in a facility with limited external security, positioned in a ward with a single main entrance and 2 windows that looked out onto an unmonitored service alley. A transport route that, if it had gone through a federal liaison office, had been known to at least 4 administrative layers before the patient's feet ever touched this floor. 4 layers was 3 too many in Mara's experience. She restocked the supply cart and watched the clock. At 12:31 a.m., Kellerman called her over for a pain medication question, and while she was at his bedside, he dropped his voice and said, "Something's wrong with the parking lot cameras." She looked at him. "My buddy in security mentioned it when he passed through 20 minutes ago. East lot cameras went dark around midnight. They figured it was a system glitch." His voice was still casual, the words floating past like they were nothing, but his eyes were steady. "Thought you might want to know, for no particular reason." Mara finished checking his chart. "Thanks for letting me know." "Don't mention it." He watched her walk away. She went to the nursing station and spent 30 seconds pretending to update a file while actually looking at the building's security monitoring feed on the secondary screen. East lot cameras, offline. North service entrance, signal degraded. The backup generator status light was green, which meant it was functional, which meant if someone wanted to cut primary power, they'd have to do it manually, and they'd have to know where the cutoff was. The cutoff was in the basement maintenance room, which meant someone had been inside this building before tonight, doing reconnaissance, learning the layout. She thought about the patient's words. "They will come." She went back to Bay 7 and stood at the edge of Halbrook's work, and while he talked through the case with his residents, she quietly made sure she knew exactly where every piece of medical equipment in that bay was located, how heavy each item was, and how many steps it was from every position in the room to the bay entrance. This was not something she was aware she was doing, it was just something she did. At 1:02 a.m., the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a surge. They simply ceased. The monitors died with a sound like a collective exhale. For exactly 3 seconds, Ward C was in total darkness and total silence. Then, the emergency lights kicked on, bathing everything in the dull red-orange that emergency backup systems always produced, the color of something between urgency and warning. Monitors rebooted on backup power. Nurses called out status checks across the ward. Halbrook's voice cut through the noise with a sharp battery backup on the main line now, directed at no one in particular. Mara was already at the bay entrance. She looked down the corridor. The 2 marshals who had been positioned at the Ward C entrance were moving toward the security station, which was the correct protocol for a power failure. Establish communication, verify status, confirm patient security. The plainclothes woman with the close-cropped hair was still in position near Bay 7. The man at the bay entrance had moved 1 step left to cover the angle from the corridor. All correct. All standard. What was not standard was the sound that reached her from the direction of the stairwell, approximately 40 meters down the main corridor. It was very quiet. A trained ear would have recognized it as the specific sound of a suppressed firearm discharging in an enclosed space. Not a movie-style whisper, but a short, contained crack, distinctly different from any mechanical or medical sound a hospital would normally produce. 1 shot. Then, after 2 seconds, a second. Mara turned back into the bay. "Dr. Halbrook," she said. Her voice was flat and level. "We need to move the patient, now." Halbrook looked up from his work with an expression calibrated to communicate irritation at an interruption. "Excuse me? We need to move him. There's a security issue in the corridor and this bay position. Nurse Voss." He said it with the particular patience of a man who had long ago decided that certain categories of people required careful management. "We are in the middle of a procedure. Patient movement is not happening. If there's a security concern, that's what the federal agents are here for. Your job is—" The plainclothes woman pushed past both of them, her hand at her hip, her eyes on the bay entrance. "I need everyone away from the windows," she said quietly. Not a suggestion. Halbrook turned to her with the same expression he'd just used on Mara. He was constitutionally incapable of adjusting it for different audiences. "Excuse me, who authorized you to— Agent Stroud, Federal Protective Detail." She didn't look at him. She was watching the door. "Sir, I need you to step back from the patient. This patient is in critical condition." A sound moved through the corridor outside. Not another shot. Something heavier. Footsteps, but the kind that came from people who knew how to minimize them and still couldn't fully suppress the weight of what they were carrying. The patient in Bay 7, who had been watching all of this with the alert and calculating eyes Mara had noticed from the beginning, said quietly, "They're inside." Halbrook opened his mouth. Mara said, "Doctor, please step back." Something in her voice made him actually stop. It wasn't louder than her normal register. It wasn't commanding in any theatrical sense. It was simply certain, in the way that very few things in a hospital are certain, direct and unambiguous and containing within it the clear implication that discussion was not available as an option. Halbrook stepped back. The first gunman appeared in the bay entrance 2 seconds later. He was broad, masked, wearing tactical gear that suggested professional rather than improvised, and he swept the room with his weapon in a practiced arc that covered the corners first, then the center. His eyes went immediately to the patient in Bay 7. Agent Stroud moved. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not clean or surgical in the way action sequences in movies tended to be. It was fast and brutal and didn't go entirely as intended. Stroud got her weapon up, but the angle was wrong. The gunman had positioned himself to make that angle wrong, which meant he'd studied this, which meant this was not a reactive team, but a planned extraction. He caught her arm. There was a collision of bodies, and her weapon discharged once into the ceiling before he drove her into the equipment cart. She went down hard. The gunman leveled his weapon at the patient. In the emergency light, Mara's face was calm. She wasn't standing where she'd been a moment ago. She'd moved without anyone tracking the movement, which was the thing about Ward C's particular geography. The supply cart in the northeast corner created a sightline interruption from the bay entrance, and she had been at the supply cart, and now she was not at the supply cart, and the gunman had not processed this yet. He processed it when her elbow connected with the nerve cluster at the inside of his weapon arm. The weapon didn't drop completely. He was trained well enough to maintain partial grip, but his arm went numb from the elbow down, which was enough. She moved inside his reach, which was the only place where his size stopped being an advantage, and she used the 3 seconds of instability that created to redirect his weapon away from the patient, control his arm against its natural joint movement, and bring his weight forward and down in a way that had him on the floor before anyone in the room fully understood what was happening. He hit hard. She was already stepping back. The residents were pressed against the far wall. Dr. Halbrook was standing absolutely still with an expression that had never crossed his face before. The patient in Bay 7 was watching her with the same flat, evaluating look he'd used from the beginning, unsurprised. She took the weapon from the gunman's loosened grip, verified the safety, and looked at the room. Stroud. The agent was already pulling herself up, bleeding from a cut above her eye, reaching for her backup weapon. "How many?" "At least 6, Stroud said, her voice steady despite everything. "Possibly 8. They cut the outside communication lines. We have no external contact." The marshals, "I don't know." Stroud got to her feet and positioned herself between the patient and the door. Her eyes went to Mara and something moved in them, a rapid reprocessing of information. "Who are you?" "I work here." Mara checked the corridor through the edge of the bay entrance, staying out of the sight line. Empty, immediate area. But from somewhere toward the nurses' station, another set of those careful weighted footsteps. And from further back, raised voices that cut off too quickly. "We need to move the patient off this floor. They know where he is. Staying in Bay 7 is not an option. He's post-procedure. Moving him is survivable. Staying here isn't." She looked at the patient directly. "Can you move?" "Yes," he said. No hesitation. "I need a gurney stabilized with the portable monitor. 2 minutes." She was already at the supply side. "Dr. Halbrook." Halbrook was still frozen, still processing the fact that the nurse he'd threatened with reassignment to pediatrics 40 minutes ago had just put a trained gunman on the floor. "Doctor," her voice was the same level, certain register. "I need you to function right now. Can you do that?" A long pause. Then something settled in his face. Not understanding exactly, but the professional reflex of a man who'd spent 30 years responding to crises in medical settings. "Yes. Mobile monitoring, portable IV line, minimum setup for transport. 2 minutes. 1.5, he said, and moved. From the corridor came the sound of something heavy falling, and then a man's voice shouting a command in a language that wasn't English. Kellerman's voice cut through from Bay 3. "What the hell is happening out there?" Mara went to the bay entrance and swept the corridor quickly. Clear for now, but from the stairwell end, movement. Shapes in the emergency lighting, tactical and methodical. 2 of them, moving bay to bay. Ward C. She raised her voice to exactly the level needed to cover the ward without going further. "Everyone on the floor, under your beds if you can move. If you can't, stay low and do not call out." A pause. "This is not a drill." Silence. Then the sound of people moving, a few quiet curses, the creak of beds being shifted. "Who's running the show?" Kellerman's voice, from Bay 3, was stripped of its earlier casualness. "All business now." "I am," Mara said. A beat. "Copy that," Kellerman said. She was back in Bay 7. Halbrook had the mobile setup assembled faster than she'd given him credit for. The IV lines transferred, the patient sitting up with the particular controlled focus of someone running on adrenaline and training rather than any good physical condition. Stroud was at the bay entrance, weapon ready. "There's a service corridor behind the supply room," Mara said, moving. "Access through the panel on the north wall. It runs parallel to the main corridor and connects to the freight elevator at the east end. The elevator's on emergency power. It'll operate." "Where does the freight elevator go?" Stroud asked. "Basement, which is where they cut the main power from." She met the agent's eyes. "But the basement also has a secondary security station with hardline communication that bypasses the main switchboard. It's not wireless. They can't jam it. You know this building well for a nurse." "I know every building I work in," Mara said, and she moved them out. The service corridor was narrow and ran in the dark. The emergency lighting didn't reach it, and Mara moved through the blackout ahead of the gurney by memory and touch, one hand trailing the wall, her mind mapping each turn against the blueprint she'd built on her first day in this facility. Behind her, Halbrook pushed the gurney with grim efficiency. Stroud covered their rear. They were 15 meters from the freight elevator when the service corridor door at the far end opened. Backlit by emergency light, a figure. Weapon up. The shot went over Mara's head by less than a foot. She'd already moved, dropping below the angle of fire and pushing to the wall. In the narrow space, the sound was enormous despite the suppressor. Stroud returned fire from behind her. 2 shots, and the figure in the doorway went down. "Go," Mara said. They went. The freight elevator descended in a slow, grinding complaint, the kind of sound that, under normal circumstances, would have been simply an annoyance. In the dark, on emergency power, with a wounded intelligence asset and a bleeding federal agent and a surgeon who was discovering things about his night shift staff that were fundamentally rearranging his understanding of the world, in that context, the elevator's reluctant mechanical groan felt like the sound of everything holding together by the thinnest possible margin. The patient reached out and caught Mara's wrist. Not hard, just enough. "What is your name?" he asked. "Mara Voss." "You served." Not a question. She looked at him in the dark. "Everybody here served. It's a military medical center." "Not like that." He paused, breathing carefully around the pain. "The way you moved, the way you calculated the corridor, the way you knew about the hardline communication in the basement that they don't put on the public building diagram." Another pause. "Who did you serve with?" The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto the basement, and the emergency lighting here was brighter. The security station was directly ahead, 20 meters, and through the reinforced glass of the door, Mara could see the panel of hardline communication equipment, dark now because no one was staffing it, but functional, waiting. She also saw, from the corner of her eye, the maintenance room door at the far end of the basement. It was ajar. It had been closed when she'd done her walkthrough of the building at the beginning of her shift. "Someone's already down here," she said quietly. Stroud moved up beside her. "How many points of entry to this level?" 3. Elevator, main stairwell, and the loading dock access tunnel. She looked at the tunnel door on the south wall. Closed, still sealed. Tunnel's been offline for 2 weeks, so, theoretically, a sound from behind the maintenance room door. Specific and deliberate. Someone wanting to be heard. Mara held up a fist. Everyone stopped. She studied the maintenance room door, the quality of the silence coming from it, the angle of the light through the gap, the specific stillness that a space had when someone was standing on the near side of a door versus the far side. Near side. The door opened. The man who came through was not tactical. No mask, no weapon raised. He was 50s, thick in the middle, wearing a building services uniform that had his name stitched above the breast pocket. His hands were visible, shaking. His face was the white of someone who'd been cornered in a room for 30 minutes waiting to find out who was going to come through the elevator doors. "Don't shoot," he said. "I work here. Maintenance. I was down here doing the overnight generator check when the power went out and I heard the shots and He stopped, swallowed. "Is it real? Is it actually happening up there?" "Yes," Mara said. "What's your name?" "Garza. Tomas Garza." "Okay, Tomas. We need the hardline station unlocked and operational. Can you do that?" He blinked at her. "I just do maintenance. The panel access for the secondary security station. You have a master key for every mechanical and utility access point in this building. That includes the communications panel." She watched his face. "I need you to open it." He looked at her, then at the agent, the surgeon, the patient on the gurney, the weapon in her hand. "Yeah," he said. "I can open it." They moved. The communications panel came online in under a minute. Garza's hands were shaking badly enough that he fumbled the first key insertion, but he got it on the second try, and the hardline board lit up green across all its indicators. Stroud moved immediately to the transmission panel, entering what looked like a specific sequence rather than a standard call code. "Federal Emergency Relay," she said while her hands moved. "Encrypted. It'll take 3 minutes to authenticate," and from above them, through the building's bones, came a sound that none of them had heard yet, and that changed the quality of everything. An explosion, not large, controlled, deliberate, the kind of charge used to breach a reinforced door, from the vibration pattern somewhere on the floor directly above them. Ward C. They're going for the ward, Stroud said. They know we moved the patient, Mara said, which means they know the layout well enough to anticipate the routes. She looked at the ceiling, calculating. The service corridor exit on the north end opens into the hospital's exterior on the east side. If they're sending a team to the ward and a team to cut off the exits, we're being funneled, the patient said. His voice was steady. This is a compression tactic. Move the target to a choke point. The lights in the basement went out entirely. Not the emergency system this time. Everything. Gone. The communications panel dimming to its battery backup reserve, which gave them approximately 40 minutes of operational capacity. In the dark, Mara's voice was level. Stroud, did the relay connect? Partial authentication. It went through as a distress signal. The response team will have the location. How long? A pause that was not comfortable. Minimum 22 minutes. 22 minutes. In a building with an unknown number of armed operatives, one critical patient, a compromised agent, and 43 wounded soldiers in a ward that had just taken a breach charge through a reinforced door. Okay, Mara said. She checked the weapon she'd taken, verified the load, set it. Garza. She found the maintenance man by the sound of his breathing. Is there a mechanical access route from the basement to the floor above Ward C? Not the elevator, not the main stairwell. The utility chase. It's basically a maintenance crawl space. It runs the electrical conduit up through. Where is the access point? East wall. Behind the water heater units, there's a panel. His voice was steadier now. People got steadier when they were given specific tasks. But it's tight, and it comes out inside the housekeeping closet on the ward level, right next to the junction of the main corridor and the North Bay access. She'd mapped that closet her first week. She mapped every closet. I know where it is. Mara. Stroud's voice carried a specific weight. What are you doing? There are 43 patients in that ward. A pause. And 3 minutes ago, someone blew a door on that floor. We have one weapon, and you have one weapon. She moved toward the east wall and the sound of the water heaters. You have one critical patient, one surgeon, and one maintenance worker. You stay here, you protect the patient, you wait for the response team, and you do not let anyone into this basement unless they can authenticate to you in person. A long silence in the dark. You're a nurse, Stroud said. Not dismissive. Something else, a question being asked in the only way she could currently ask it. Yes, Mara said. She found the panel, felt the edge of it. Get me a flashlight from the emergency kit on the east wall, would you? The flashlight appeared in her hand 30 seconds later. Garza had retrieved it, his hand steadier than she expected. She clicked it on, examined the panel, pulled it open. The access was exactly what she'd been told. Tight, vertical, running up through the building's utility infrastructure like the inside of a mechanical throat. Conduit lines on both sides. A series of metal rungs bolted into the wall every 18 inches. She looked at it. Behind her, Dr. Halbrook said, in a voice she'd never heard from him before, I was wrong about you. She glanced back. In the flashlight's secondary glow, his face had shed the architecture of authority it normally wore. He looked simply like a man, older than she'd thought of him, more uncertain. You didn't know, she said. Get Stroud and the patient to the secondary position behind the water units. Don't move unless you hear an all-clear or a confirmed authentication. She pulled herself into the utility chase. The rungs were cold and the space was exactly as cramped as advertised. And above her the building groaned and she could hear, transmitted through the structure, voices moving on the floor above. Multiple sets of footsteps, coordinated, purposeful, the acoustic signature of a search pattern rather than a retreat. They were going room to room in Ward C, looking for the patient who wasn't there, and the 43 men and women in those rooms had nowhere to go. She moved up through the dark, one rung at a time, her arms and shoulders taking the work without complaint. The scar on her left hand where it gripped the cold metal was a familiar point of pressure. Above her, through the building's bones, she could hear Kellerman's voice, distant, muffled, but unmistakable. Still there, still standing. She moved faster. The utility chase narrowed somewhere around the midpoint, a junction where two conduit runs converged and the available space dropped from tight to genuinely hostile. and Mara had to angle her shoulders and pull through with her arms doing work her legs couldn't contribute to. The metal rungs were older here, and the third one she grabbed flexed slightly under her weight before holding. She registered it and moved on. The building around her was not quiet. Through the conduit lines and the concrete substrate, she could hear the ward above. Voices she couldn't make out, the sound of doors being opened and closed with the systematic efficiency of people conducting a sweep rather than a search. Organized, patient, taking their time because they believed they controlled the timeline. They didn't know the timeline had changed. She reached the access panel at the top in what her internal sense of elapsed time estimated at under 4 minutes, though it felt longer in the compressed dark. The panel was latched from this side, building maintenance logic, not security logic, designed to be opened by someone doing conduit work rather than to resist entry. She put 2 fingers through the catch, felt the resistance, and applied pressure at the specific angle that would release the latch without producing the clang of a forced entry. It opened without a sound. The housekeeping closet on the ward C level was dark. The emergency lighting reached the corridor outside, but not inside the closet itself, which meant the gap at the bottom of the door gave her a strip of dull orange-red. She listened. The corridor immediately outside was clear of footsteps, but not of sound. From the direction of the main bay access, she could hear voices, 2 of them, speaking in short, clipped exchanges that had the cadence of operational communication rather than conversation. 2 operatives covering the bay junction. Standard coverage for a sweep team of the size Stroud had estimated. If there were 6 to 8 in total, 2 were likely still dealing with whatever had happened at the ward entrance, 2 were running the room-to-room sweep, and 2 were holding the junction, which left somewhere between 0 and 2 unaccounted for. She gave herself 10 seconds in the dark to let her eyes finish adjusting, then eased the closet door open by the width of her hand and looked. The 2 at the junction were facing away from her, their attention on the bay access points, weapons at the ready low. The position of people who were covering ground and expected contact from a specific direction. They were maybe 15 meters away. Between her and them, the corridor was empty. Behind her, further down the ward, the sweep team was in bay 5 or 6 by the sound of it. She could hear a patient's voice raised briefly, then cut off. Then the particular silence of someone being told very clearly not to speak again. She needed to know where Kellerman was. She eased the door open further, slipped through, and pressed against the wall beside the closet entrance. Moved toward the junction. Her shoes on the hospital floor made sound, not much, but enough. And she adjusted her weight distribution as she went, the old habit of moving in a way that minimized acoustic signature, transferring weight heel to toe with the outside edge of the foot rather than the natural rolling center. It added fractional seconds to each step and reduced the sound by enough to matter. 8 meters? 6. 4. She was inside the effective reaction distance before the one on the left caught the peripheral movement. He was good. His response time was fast, and he started the pivot correctly, driving his elbow back as a counter even before his eyes had fully processed what he was turning toward. But the pivot committed him to a vector she was no longer occupying, and she let his own momentum carry the elbow past her and stepped into the space it created, her forearm finding the nerve juncture at his weapon arm in the same way it had found the first one in Bay 7. His weapon arm went offline. Her other hand found his larynx. Not a strike, a compress, enough to take his voice. The second operative had 2 seconds to respond, and he used them almost correctly. Almost because the corridor width at the junction limited his angle, and he was choosing between a shot that risked the first operative and repositioning to a clean angle, and that half second of choice was the half second that mattered. She drove the first operative sideways into him, controlled descent, and came down on the second one's weapon arm with her knee before he finished going down. Both on the floor, neither dead. She hadn't killed anyone yet tonight, and she had no intention of starting. Unconscious, weapon-free, and flex-cuffed with the zip ties from the housekeeping cart she'd clocked on her second day working this ward, she didn't carry them for this purpose, but she'd known they were there, the way she knew where everything was. 23 seconds since she'd come through the closet door. She stood up, gathered both weapons, checked them, and went toward Bay 3. Kellerman was on the floor beside his bed, which was not a position his hip surgery encouraged, and the expression on his face when she came through the entrance was one she'd remember. Relief layered over something raw, the look of a man who'd been doing math about survival odds and not liking the numbers. Voss. His voice was barely audible. How many came through this section? 2. They looked in every bay, told everyone to stay put and stay quiet, took phones. He pushed himself partially up, and she saw him register the 2 weapons in her hands and the absence of anyone following her in. Where's the team from the basement? Still there, protecting the asset. She scanned the bay. How many patients in this ward are mobile? He thought quickly. She could see him running the count. 3 fully. Another 4 if you're not worried about speed. The rest are surgical recovery or traction. The sweep team is in the rear bays. I need the mobile patients moved to the service corridor access on the north wall. Can you organize that? In the dark, without making noise, while there are armed men 20 meters away. A pause. Yeah, I can do that. Tell them to move on my signal. I'll create a distraction. She looked at him steadily. Kellerman, the signal is going to be hard to miss. He looked at her for a long moment. The measuring quality was completely gone from his expression. In its place was something much simpler and more direct. Who did you serve with? He asked. It was the same question the patient had asked her in the elevator. She gave him the same non-answer she'd given then. Not because she was being evasive, but because right now it didn't matter, and they both knew it. Give me 90 seconds, she said, and moved back into the corridor. The sweep team had reached Bay 6 when she came around the junction at the far end of the ward. 2 of them. Confirmed. Moving professionally, one covering while the other cleared, not rushing. They'd found the ward mostly empty of the one person they were looking for, and their body language had shifted from extraction to containment. They were being thorough now because they were reporting back to someone, and the report needed to be complete. She let them get deep into Bay 6. What she did next was not elegant. She would not have described it as any kind of controlled technique. She threw a metal emesis basin down the corridor toward the nurse's station. It hit the floor and produced a sound that was simply impossible to ignore in a space that had been that quiet. And in the 2 seconds of the sweep team's reflexive response to the sound, she closed the distance to Bay 6 in a dead run. The first one was still processing the origin of the sound when she came through the bay entrance. She took him down fast and hard, and not cleanly. He got his elbow into her ribs on the way down, a solid hit that she felt as a dull, bright flash of pain across her left side, and she filed it under deal with later and moved. The second one was a different calculation. He'd already swung his weapon around by the time she cleared the first, and the angle was real. She couldn't close it in time. She read this in the geometry of the space in the fraction of a second she had, and she went sideways instead of forward, behind the nearest patient bed, and the shot that discharged, not suppressed, the suppressor having apparently run out of baffling capacity at some point in the last hour, cracked loud enough to echo through the entire ward, which was fine. Loud was fine. Loud was the signal. She went over the bed, used the IV pole the bed's current occupant, currently flat on the floor, bless him, ahead of her instruction, had been connected to as an extended reach, caught the operative's weapon arm at range, and closed from there. It took longer than Bay 7 had. Her ribs were informing her about the elbow in sustained and emphatic terms. He was good, and he fought dirty, and they put 2 pieces of medical equipment on the floor before she got the angle she needed, and he stopped being a problem. She stood up. Her ribs hurt. Her forearms hurt. She had a cut on her right palm from somewhere in the last 45 seconds that she hadn't noticed acquiring. In the corridor outside Bay 6, she heard movement. The mobile patients from the rear bays, Kellerman's voice directing them in a murmur. The careful, controlled sound of people who understood that quiet was survival. Moving toward the north service corridor access. Good. She looked at the 2 operatives on the floor, confirmed they were breathing, and went to the corridor. Kellerman was at the north wall panel with 4 patients around him, one in a wheelchair being pushed by another who probably shouldn't have been walking. He looked at her as she came toward them. That shot came from in here, he said. I know. Your ribs okay? No? She went to this panel and opened it. The service corridor was dark beyond. Get them through, all the way to the east end. Wait at the freight elevator door. Do not call it up. She thought about what was in the basement. There are people down there protecting the asset. Friendly. Do not approach until you can see them clearly. He looked at the 4 patients, then back at her. What are you doing? There are still at least 2 operatives unaccounted for, possibly more at the main ward entrance. She checked the weapon. I need to know where they are before the response team arrives. The response team. He processed this. How long? She looked at the time on a wall clock at the end of the corridor. The response relay had gone out approximately 16 minutes ago. 6 minutes, give or take. Give or take. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Voss? He stopped. Seemed to decide something. My unit, 3rd Special Forces Group, did 2 rotations through Ardhal Province between 2017 and 2019. We had a combat applications advisor attached to us for the 2nd rotation. Classified in bed, no rank insignia, no unit identification. He paused. She was the best operator I'd ever seen. Any gender. We had her for 4 months, and then she was reassigned, and we were told to not mention the attachment in any after-action reports. Mara looked at him. I'm not saying I recognize you, Kellerman said carefully, because I never saw that advisor's face in any documentation, and her file was sealed. Get them through the panel, Mara said. He held her gaze for 1 more second. Yes, Nurse Voss, he said, and meant it differently than he ever had before. She went toward the main ward entrance. The entrance to Ward C was a pair of reinforced double doors, and what was left of them was not encouraging. The breach charge had taken out the door frame and the left panel entirely. The right panel hung at an angle from its lower hinge, swinging slightly in the disturbed air. Glass from the adjacent observation window was distributed across the corridor in a radius that cracked under her feet, regardless of how carefully she stepped. The 2 federal marshals who had been stationed outside Ward C were not visible. This was information. Not necessarily about their status. They could have pulled back to a defensive position, could have gone to support the agent Stroud downstairs, could be doing any number of tactically reasonable things. But the absence needed to be noted and filed as an unknown. She moved through the gap where the doors had been and into the external corridor. It was quieter here. The emergency lighting in the main hospital corridor was better. Standard building code required higher lumen output in primary corridors versus ward sections, so the orange-red here was more orange than red, closer to actual visibility. She could see the corridor extending in both directions, the nursing station 30 meters to the right, the elevator bank 40 meters to the left. At the elevator bank, she found one of the marshals. He was seated against the wall, alive, applying direct pressure to a wound in his thigh that was bad but not immediately critical. His weapon was in his other hand, pointed at her as she came around the corner, and then lowered when he processed her uniform. Federal Marshal Daines, he said. His voice was controlled and tight. Who are you? Mara Voss, Ward C nursing staff. She moved to him, shifted his hand to check the pressure dressing he'd improvised from his jacket. Where's your partner? Went after 2 of them toward the south wing. Lost contact 8 minutes ago. He grimaced as she tightened the dressing. There's a command element somewhere in this building, not the ground team, someone directing them. I heard relay communication when they breached the ward, voice traffic going to and from a position inside the building. Inside. Not a vehicle, not an external position. Someone is running this from inside Ironvale. His eyes were sharp despite the pain. They knew the layout. They knew where the patient was being moved before we moved him. They have a source inside the facility. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at him. A source inside the facility, which meant the intelligence breach hadn't happened at the federal liaison level. Or not only there. Someone in the building, someone with access to the patient's location and the security layout, had fed information to the team outside. She thought about the East Lot cameras going dark at midnight, just as the patient was being brought in. She thought about Denton at the front desk, who had known the intake details and the security arrangement, and had seemed, when she'd looked back at him from the corridor, to be watching the monitor feeds rather than the paperwork. She thought about how specific the camera failure had been. Not a system glitch. Targeted. East Lot only, which covered the primary approach route. Someone had flagged that location. The charge nurse, she said, at the main intake desk. Daines looked at her. When did you last see him? A pause. He was at intake when we brought the patient in. His expression changed. He left the desk approximately 12 minutes before the power went out. Told the night staff he was doing a medication check run. Nobody did medication check runs at midnight during a federal patient intake. Where would someone in this building go, Mara said, if they needed to stay connected to an external communication network but didn't want to be visible on the ward? Daines's jaw tightened. Supply storage, administrative offices, Any enclosed room with external wall access for a signal. She was already up. Stay here, she said. Response team is approximately 4 minutes out. You're going to hear some things and you need to stay at this position. What things? But she was already moving. The administrative wing of Unravel Medical Center was on the same floor as Ward C, accessed through a connecting corridor that ran along the building's south spine. It was dark now, fully dark without even the emergency lighting of the ward sections, and she moved through it with the flashlight off and her eyes adapting to the ambient light that leaked under doorways and from the exit signs at the corridor junctions. She was looking for a specific quality of stillness. When someone was actively working, typing, speaking, monitoring, they produced a micro-environment of sound around them. Breathing that was slightly elevated, the subtle movement of fabric, the nearly inaudible signal of focus. She'd learned to read it a long time ago. It was the kind of skill that you couldn't teach in a classroom and couldn't explain after the fact. You either learned to hear it or you didn't. She heard it from behind the third door on the left. The door was labeled Administrative Coordinator, Night Operations, which was the kind of title that existed in every large institution to cover a category of function too miscellaneous for a more specific descriptor. She stood outside it for 5 seconds, reading the sound profile from within. One person. Seated. The quality of the breathing suggested focus and stress, not calm monitoring. Active operation, not surveillance. She opened the door. Denton looked up from the desk. He had a communications device in his hand, not a standard hospital radio, something smaller and more specialized, and a laptop open in front of him showing what appeared to be a building schematic with moving indicators on it. His face did exactly what faces did when the thing they'd been managing suddenly came apart. It went through surprise, through calculation, and landed somewhere between defiance and the particular fear of a person who had made a significant bet and was watching it lose. "Mara," he said. She stood in the doorway, weapon in hand, and looked at him. Of everything she had felt tonight, the cold of the utility chase, the bright pain of the elbow in her ribs, the sustained, controlled focus that had carried her through every door and down every corridor, this was the sharpest. Because Denton had been decent to her. When Halbrook had dismissed her, Denton had been matter-of-fact and fair. He'd given her the patient board without editorializing. He'd said, "I know you will," when she said she'd be careful, and he'd meant it. And he'd been selling the location of a protected intelligence asset to a mercenary extraction team. "How long?" she asked. He set the communications device down. "Mara, how long have you been working with them?" A pause. He was calculating still, looking at the device, looking at the schematic on the laptop, looking at the weapon, running the math on remaining options. 8 months, he said. "They told you it was an intelligence operation." He met her eyes. "They said it was a government contract, privatized, that the asset had information that was being suppressed by—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what they told me." "No," she said. "It doesn't. The people in this building are alive because you made a mistake in your planning." Her voice was still level, still the same register. "You put the asset in a ward with a service corridor, a utility chase, and a secondary hardline communication system. If you'd put him in a bay without those features, the response relay might not have gone out." She watched his face. "Did you choose Bay 7? A pause that was itself an answer. "The surgical setup there is the best for abdominal trauma," he said quietly. "I know. I think you made a genuine medical judgment and it happened to work against your own plan." She looked at him for a moment. "Tell me where the command element is in this building." "I don't know what you— There is someone directing the ground team from an internal position, not the breach team, a command element. Where are they?" He looked at the laptop screen, at the moving indicators, and she could see him making a decision, not a complex one, not a heroic one. The simple decision of a person who has reached the place where the thing they've been doing stops being sustainable and there is nothing left to defend. "Radiology suite," he said. "Second floor, south end. There's a viewing room off the main imaging suite that has hardened walls for the imaging equipment. It blocks signals. They can communicate out, but nothing comes in from building security systems." She crossed the room in 5 steps, took the communications device from the desk, and verified the schematic on the laptop. The moving indicators were the ground team, 4 of them, still active in the building, and one stationary position in the location Denton had just described. "Lock the door after I leave," she said. "Don't touch this equipment. Don't make any transmissions." She looked at him one final time. "When the response team arrives, you will identify yourself and you will cooperate fully. Do you understand?" He nodded. His face had the emptied quality of someone who had already begun the long process of living with what they'd done. "I have 20 years here," he said. Not an excuse, just a fact, offered into the room. She left without answering. The stairwell to the second floor was clear. She went up 2 levels and moved along the south corridor toward radiology, and here the building was fully quiet. Nobody on this floor, emergency lighting the only presence, the imaging suites dark behind their heavy doors. The viewing room Denton had described was at the end of the imaging suite access corridor, a room within a room, and the door was steel framed with a reinforced seal around the edge. She stood outside it and listened. Inside, one voice, speaking in short transmissions, checking in with the ground team. The voice had authority, not the operational tone of a field operator, but the controlled delivery of a command element managing a mission that had gone sideways and was attempting to bring it back to a workable outcome. She heard her own name. Not Mara Voss. The name underneath. The one that wasn't in her Iron Veil personnel file. She went very still. The voice inside said, "Confirmed Voss is the embedded asset. This changes the extraction parameters. We take the nurse with the package, or we abort." A pause. "No, she has operational value that supersedes the original target. The people who placed her here will want her returned before any of this becomes public." Another pause, longer. "Do not engage without confirmation. She will be armed by now. She is—" A short, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. "She is not what she appeared to be when she was assigned to that ward." Mara stood in the corridor outside a steel-reinforced door and processed what she had just heard. Not just a mercenary extraction of an intelligence asset. That was the surface operation, the visible layer. Underneath it, underneath the breach team and the power cut and the systematic sweep of Ward C, was something else. A second objective that had apparently become the primary one the moment the ground team confirmed her identity. Someone had placed her here. She thought about her reassignment to Iron Veil 8 weeks ago. The transfer orders that had come through administrative channels with no explanation beyond operational relocation, which happened in military medical systems often enough that she hadn't questioned it. The specific assignment to Ward C, to the military patients, to the floor that handled federal intakes. She thought about the patient's eyes when he'd first seen her, the way he'd assessed her. They will come. He'd known. He'd known before tonight. He'd known she was going to be there. From somewhere in the building below her, from the direction of the external access points, she heard, faintly, the beginning of a sound that grew rapidly from faint to unmistakable. Helicopters. Multiple rotor signatures, close together, descending fast. The response team, less than a minute out. And from the south corridor behind her, the sound of boots. 2 sets, moving toward her position, the remaining ground operatives converging on the radiology suite. And she understood in the geometry of that sound that they weren't converging to retreat. They were converging to extract their command element before the response team hit the building. She had perhaps 45 seconds. She looked at the steel door in front of her, at the corridor behind her, at the single stairwell access between her current position and the floor below, where Marshal Danes was holding with a leg wound and where, somewhere in the basement, Stroud was protecting a patient who knew more about Mara Voss than Mara currently knew about herself. The boots were closer. 30 seconds. She raised the weapon and knocked on the steel door with the butt of it. 3 times. The particular cadence of someone delivering a message rather than requesting entry. The voice inside stopped transmitting. 20 seconds. "I know you're in there," she said, her voice carrying easily through the gap at the door's base. "And I know you just changed the objective, which means you know who I am." A pause. "So you also know that whatever you're planning in the next 20 seconds has about a 30% chance of working. And you know that I know that." 15 seconds. The boots reached the corridor junction. "The response team is 40 seconds from entry," she said. "You can try to extract through this floor, which means going through me and then through a federal response team with air support." A pause. "Or you can tell me who placed me at Iron Veil." and I'll let you make a different decision." Silence from inside the room. 10 seconds. The two ground operatives came around the corner and saw her and raised their weapons. She had her own up, and she had the angle, and she had, at that moment, the very clear and specific sensation of a situation that had been large and chaotic all night, suddenly contracting to a single point. This corridor, these people, this door, and the name of whoever had moved her into position like a piece on a board without telling her what game was being played. "Last offer," she said, and her voice was absolutely steady. The command element inside the room said nothing. The helicopters outside the building were very loud now. And then the steel door opened. The steel door opened, and the man who came through it was not what she'd constructed from the voice alone. She'd heard command authority and assumed the physical architecture that usually accompanied it. Size, bearing, the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a room. What she got instead was a man of maybe 5'9", slight in the shoulders, somewhere in his early 60s, wearing civilian clothes that were slightly too good for the context. Gray at the temples. A face that had been unremarkable for so long it had become its own kind of camouflage. He held his hands away from his body with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular gesture many times and found it neither humiliating nor alarming. His eyes went immediately to hers, not to the weapon, to her face. "Voss," he said. The voice matched. Controlled, measured, the tone of a man conducting a meeting rather than surrendering at gunpoint in a darkened hospital corridor. "You look well." "I don't know you," she said. "No, you wouldn't." A pause. "We haven't been formally introduced." The two ground operatives were still in her peripheral vision, weapons up, doing the math on the geometry the same way she was. The helicopters outside had reached what sounded like landing approach. Close, loud, shaking the building's windows. Maybe 20 seconds from boots on the ground outside. Maybe less. "Tell your people to put them down," she said. The man in the doorway looked at the two operatives and made a small gesture with his left hand. They lowered their weapons. Not dropped. Lowered, which told her the gesture had a specific meaning in their operational language, and she filed that away. "Who placed me at Ironvale?" she said. "That's a longer conversation than we have right now." "Then give me the short version." He studied her with those unremarkable eyes, and she had the distinct sensation of being evaluated by something much more sophisticated than his appearance suggested. "You were placed by a program that no longer officially exists. The transfer orders came through a legacy channel that's been dormant for 3 years." A pause. "Someone reactivated it 6 weeks ago to move you here. It wasn't us." "Then who?" "That," he said, "is precisely what the patient in your basement knows." From the stairwell behind the two operatives came a sound. Sharp, authoritative, the kind of voice that carried the acoustic weight of federal authority even before the words themselves resolved. "Federal Response Team, hands visible, on your knees, now." Multiple sets of boots on the stairwell, fast and organized. The man in the doorway made his decision in the time it took to blink. He turned slightly and raised his hands fully, and the motion was so practiced it looked almost like a bow. "My name is Garrison Pruitt," he said, speaking directly to Mara. "I'm a contractor operating under a private intelligence mandate. I will be arrested in approximately 10 seconds. The patient in your basement is not who the Federal Protective Detail believes he is." His eyes didn't leave hers. "Ask him about Operation Halverson. Ask him what he gave to the liaison office on February 9th. And ask him who requested your transfer to this facility." The response team came around the corridor junction in a stack, 6 operators in full tactical kit, weapons up, moving with the compressed efficiency of people who'd been briefed on a hot building and expected to find it still hot. They hit the two ground operatives first, fast and controlled, and the operatives went down without resistance. The team lead reached Pruitt in the same motion and had him against the wall in 3 seconds. Mara lowered her weapon, turned the grip outward, and held it to the side. A second operator came to her immediately. "Federal Response, identify yourself." "Mara Voss, Night Nursing Staff, Ward C. I've been with the patient and Agent Stroud since the breach. They're in the basement, secondary security station." The operator looked at her, the weapons in her hands, the cut on her palm, the way she was standing, and processed all of it in approximately 2 seconds. "Are you injured?" Cracked ribs, possibly. Nothing acute. Can you walk us to the patient's position? Yes. He keyed his radio. Lead. We have a staff member who can guide us to the asset's position. Proceeding to basement. He looked at Mara. Stay beside me. Do not get in front of my team. Understood. They went. The descent to the basement was faster, with the response team clearing the route. They moved in a configuration that turned the stairwell and the basement access corridor into a controlled space in under 90 seconds, and the call-out that Stroud answered from behind the water heater units was the most functional thing Mara had heard in over an hour. Professional voice, authentication codes, the particular relief of a federal agent handing a situation to a team that could actually hold it. The patient was still on the gurney. Halbrook was beside him, maintaining the IV line, looking like a man who had been taken apart and very imperfectly reassembled. Garza, the maintenance worker, was sitting on the floor against the far wall with his knees up and his head down, doing the quiet work of surviving something he hadn't expected to survive. The response team's medical element came in behind the tactical element and moved immediately to the patient. Mara stepped back and let them work. And in the space of stepping back, she felt, for the first time since the lights went out, the full inventory of what the night had cost her physically. The ribs were the main event. Every breath she took had a specific and unwelcome character to it, the kind of pain that wasn't dramatic but was completely insistent. Her forearms had locked up slightly from the sustained tension. The cut on her palm had stopped bleeding but had stiffened. Halbrook appeared beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at the response team, at the patient, at the systematic way the tactical operators were moving through the basement and clearing it. His face had the quality of a person who had revised a significant number of assumptions in a short time and was still running through the implications. Your ribs, he said finally. I know. Let me look. She almost said no. The instinct was still there, the one that said she handled her own injuries, that accepting care was a vulnerability in a situation that wasn't fully resolved. But the situation was resolved enough, and Halbrook was standing in front of her with an expression that had nothing left of the man who'd threatened her with reassignment. He looked like a doctor, just that. Okay, she said. He palpated the left side with careful hands, and she kept her breathing controlled while he worked, which was its own kind of information. A normal person would have been breathing through it, but she regulated it automatically. She saw him register this and file it away. Probably 2 cracked, not displaced. 3rd might be bruised only. He stepped back. You need imaging. Later. Voss? Later. She looked at him. Go check on your patients upstairs. The ones in the service corridor need assessment. There are 4 of them. Kellerman organized the move. He'll know where they are. A pause. You organized the move? Kellerman executed it. Halbrook looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him trying to find the language for something that didn't have a clear precedent in his experience. He was not a man who apologized easily. She could see that clearly. The apology had to fight through 20 years of professional armor to get to the surface. The things I said to you, he started. Go check on your patients, she said, not unkindly. We'll have the other conversation when this is done. He went. Stroud came to her 5 minutes later, after the patient had been transferred to the response team's medical custody and the basement had been fully cleared. The cut above her eye had been butterfly taped by someone on the team, and she was moving stiffly but functionally. She looked at Mara with the same expression she'd had in the corridor of the utility chase, that rapid reprocessing, the sense of a file being updated in real time. Pruitt is in custody, Stroud said. The ground team, all 6 of them, we found them all, is in custody. 3 needed medical attention. She paused. None were killed. I know. That was deliberate. Yes. Stroud looked at her steadily. We're going to need a full debrief. Everything, from your initial assessment of the patient through the basement, what you did, what you saw, what you heard, all of it. I know. Specifically, Stroud said carefully, we're going to need an explanation of how a staff nurse with a standard military medical background managed to neutralize 6 trained operatives over the course of approximately 90 minutes in a dark building. Mara looked back at her. I improvised. The agent's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted slightly. The specific shift of a professional deciding how much to push something that wasn't going to move. We'll do the debrief upstairs, but first, she paused. The patient wants to speak with you. The patient was in Bay 7, which had been cleared and restored to function by the response team's medical element with an efficiency that suggested they'd done field hospital reconstruction before. The mobile monitoring equipment was back online. The IV lines were properly situated. He was lying at a 15-degree elevation, which was about as upright as his abdominal injury would currently allow. And when Mara came through the bay entrance, he was already looking at the door. "Sit," he said, which was approximately the most forward thing anyone had said to her all night, given that she was technically his nurse and he was technically her patient. She sat because her ribs were registering their opinion of the evening, and sitting was a reasonable accommodation. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, in the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, direct, measuring, operating on a set of information that he hadn't fully shared. "You heard what Pruitt said," she said. It wasn't a question. The basement acoustics carry sound unexpectedly. Yes. His accent was thicker when he was tired, she noticed. The years of flattening it came undone around the edges. "Operation Halverson." He said, "You know what it is." "I know what it was." He paused, adjusting his position slightly against the pain. Halverson was a joint intelligence program, American and Allied partners. It ran for 6 years, formally ended 8 years ago. Its purpose was to embed specialized operators in civilian and medical institutions near military facilities. He watched her face. Long-term cover. Years long, in some cases. Operators placed and then effectively forgotten, transferred into civilian roles. Given genuine institutional identities, allowed to develop real careers and real relationships within those roles. The idea was a dormant asset network. People who were invisible because they had genuinely become what their cover said they were. Mara was very still. "The program ended," he continued, "because the Oversight Committee determined it was ethically compromised. The operators hadn't been told how permanent their placement might be. Most of them," he paused, "most of them didn't know they were still considered active. They thought they'd been released. They thought their operational period was complete and their civilian roles were simply their lives now." The emergency lighting above Bay 7 had been replaced by standard fluorescent, and in that ordinary light, the ward looked almost like itself again. Nurses moving, equipment humming, the particular rhythms of a hospital at night. "February 9th, she said. "I delivered documentation to the Federal Liaison Office proving that a subset of the Halverson network had been reactivated without authorization. Someone, an individual or group operating outside the formal intelligence structure, had access to the original program architecture and was using it to reposition assets, moving people." He looked at her steadily. "You were moved 6 weeks ago. 3 other former Halverson operators were moved in the preceding 4 months. All of them into facilities near federal detention or intelligence custody points. Someone is positioning them near assets," she said, "near me specifically, and 2 others currently in federal custody at separate facilities." He paused. "The people who reactivated the network believe the former operators can be activated as well. That whatever training and conditioning went into the original placement can be triggered. That you are functionally still an asset waiting for a signal." Mara looked at her hands, at the scar on the outside of her left hand that she'd had since she was 24 and had never explained to anyone. "Who requested my transfer?" she said. "Pruitt said you know." The transfer request originated from a person using the identity of a deceased program administrator. The actual individual? He stopped, looked at the door. "I don't have a name. I have a contact point and a physical description and a specific operational pattern. I've been trying to get that information to the right people for 6 months, and the right people keep," a grimace that had nothing to do with his injury, "keep not receiving it." "The liaison office," she said. "There is a penetration in the federal oversight structure. At least one person, possibly 2, who have been filtering intelligence about the Halverson reactivation before it reaches anyone with the authority to act on it." He met her eyes. "Tonight was not simply an extraction. They were trying to take me before I could testify. And when they confirmed you were here, I became a secondary objective. You became the primary one." He said it without softening it. "They believe you can identify the person running the reactivation. Something in your original operational period, something you witnessed or documented or were involved in, something that, if you remembered it correctly and testified to it, he paused again, would make a significant number of important people's positions untenable. The ward outside the bay continued its quiet functioning. Somewhere down the corridor, she could hear Hal Brooks' voice, not commanding, not dismissive, just clinical and steady, doing the job he'd done for 30 years. Checking on patients who'd spent an hour on the floors of a ward under armed occupation and needed reassurance more than they needed medical intervention. "What do I know?" she said. "Specifically, I don't know what you know. I know what the people who reactivated the program believe you know, because I have their communications from a 6-month surveillance period." He shifted against the pain again. "They believe you witnessed a meeting, during your final operational period, an embedded assignment in a medical facility, similar to your current position. They believe you saw something or heard something that places a specific individual at the origin point of what later became the reactivation infrastructure. Her final operational period? A medical facility. She ran through the inventory of her own history the way she ran through the inventory of every room she walked into. Systematically, starting with what was certain and moving toward what was less so. She had served. She had been placed. She had, at a certain point, been told that her service was complete and her operational period was concluded, and she had built a life that was genuinely her life. Nursing school, licensure, the specific satisfaction of floor work in a military medical setting where her particular combination of skills was useful in ways she could be proud of. She had not asked many questions about the transition because she'd been told it was clean and she had wanted it to be clean, and she had been, she understood now, perhaps too willing to accept the cleanness at face value. "The facility," she said. "Where was it?" "A military medical center in Carlo, Arizona, 8 years ago." He paused. "You were there for 14 months. 8 years ago, Carlo, Arizona." She'd been there, say, the memory was clear and specific, the way all her operational memories were clear and specific. She'd worked as a nursing assistant, not a registered nurse, because her licensure hadn't been completed yet. She'd been embedded in the facility's trauma ward for a classified observation assignment she'd never been given the full parameters of. And in the 14th month, a meeting in the administrative wing that she'd walked into without being expected, because her shift had ended early and she was returning a piece of medical equipment to the supply room 2 doors down from the conference room where it was happening. She had seen 3 people in that conference room. She had recognized 2 of them. The third had his back to the door. She hadn't thought about it again. Or rather, she had thought about it, had logged it in the way she logged everything, but it had never been flagged as significant because no one had ever asked her about it, and she'd had no reason to apply significance to it retroactively. Until now. "The third person," she said quietly, to herself more than to him. In the conference room. The patient watched her. "I never saw his face," she said. "He had his back to the door, but he was—" She paused, running the 8-year-old image through a more experienced analysis than she'd been capable of at 23. "He was the one running the meeting. The other 2, people I recognized, program administrators. They were deferring to him, taking notes while he spoke. His body language was—" She stopped, because the body language she was remembering was very specific. A particular way of standing, a slight rightward lean when emphasizing a point. Hands away from the body, loose, not expressive. She had seen those hands 3 hours ago in a radiology corridor, held away from a body in the practiced ease of someone who'd made that gesture many times. "Pruitt," she said. The patient said nothing. His eyes were steady and giving her the space to follow it. Pruitt was in that conference room 8 years ago. He wasn't just the command element for tonight. He was there at the origin. He was one of the administrators running the original program. She looked at the patient directly. "He reactivated it. He moved me here. Tonight was him trying to either recover me as an asset or eliminate me before I could place him at the origin point." "Yes," the patient said simply. "You knew all of this before tonight." "I knew most of it. I didn't know you had a specific visual memory that placed him at Carlo." He paused. That is significant. That is the piece I didn't have." From the corridor outside Bay 7 came the sound of multiple sets of footsteps, organized, purposeful, not tactical, administrative. And with them, a voice she hadn't heard yet tonight, a voice carrying the specific register of institutional authority rather than operational command. Stroud appeared in the bay entrance. Her expression was careful. Voss, there are people here who want to speak with you. Intelligence oversight? Inspector General's office, and a pause. Someone else. Someone who says he knew you were here. Knew I was here as in this building, tonight? As in Ironvale. Your assignment here. Stroud's voice was measured, neither reassuring nor alarming, because she didn't know enough to be either. He came with the response team. He's been waiting downstairs. The patient on the gurney said, "Be careful with whatever he tells you. Verify independently before you act on it." Mara looked at him. "You know who it is?" "I know who it might be. If I'm right," he held her gaze. "If I'm right, the conversation you're about to have is one that was planned for you before you ever set foot in this building, before your transfer orders came through, possibly before the reactivation began." A pause. "Everything that happened tonight may have been intended to get you to this exact moment." She held still with that for 2 seconds. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform. The gesture automatic, irrelevant given the state of the uniform, but some habits ran deep, and went to the bay entrance. The man waiting in the corridor outside Ward C was in his late 50s, wearing civilian clothes over a bearing that was plainly and permanently military. Short, close-cropped hair that had gone white, a face that had the specific weathering of decades in outdoor and austere environments rather than offices. He wore no badge, no identification. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, waiting, with the absolute stillness of someone who had decided a long time ago that patience was a tool. He looked at her when she came through the remnants of the ward entrance, and something moved in his face. Relief, she thought, though it was a complicated and not entirely comfortable relief. "Sergeant Voss," he said. No one had called her that in 8 years. "I don't know you," she said. The same thing she'd said to Pruitt 90 minutes ago. "No, but I know your file." He paused. "I'm the person who should have closed the Halverson program properly 8 years ago. I signed the termination orders. I believed it was done." His voice carried the weight of something that had been sitting on it for a long time. "I was wrong. And people were hurt because I was wrong. You were positioned, without your knowledge or consent, in a situation that was supposed to be resolved 8 years ago." The corridor around them was busy with response team personnel, and now plainclothes oversight staff moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who had arrived to a scene and were documenting everything before anything could be touched or altered. Someone was taking photographs of the breached ward entrance. Someone else was speaking quietly into a recorder near the nursing station. "What is your name?" she said. "Whitmore, Deputy Director Elliot Whitmore, Intelligence Oversight Board." He held her gaze. "I am not in Pruitt's network. I want to be clear about that before anything else. The penetration in the oversight structure was not at my level. It was 2 levels below me, and it was someone I trusted, and I am going to be accountable for that trust having been misplaced." She studied him. The specific way he was standing, the specific way he was meeting her eyes, direct but not aggressive. The look of a person making themselves available to judgment rather than deflecting it. "You placed me at Ironvale," she said. "Yes." "Without telling me why?" "Yes." No hesitation, no qualification. "I knew the reactivation was happening. I knew assets were being repositioned. I needed someone inside a facility that I believed was a target, and I used the administrative mechanism I had available, the legacy transfer channel, because it was the one channel I was certain Pruitt's people hadn't compromised." A pause. "I told myself it was the only option, that the operation required it, that you would be safe because the response relay would be in place and the response time would be adequate. It wasn't adequate. No." The word landed flat and undecorated. "People were shot. A federal agent was injured. A marshal has a wound that is going to affect his mobility for months." She held her voice level with the effort it required. 43 patients spent an hour on the floors of a military medical ward. "Yes. And I spent 14 months in Carlo, 8 years ago, without knowing what I was actually part of or what I was observing. She paused. And you knew about that, and you moved me here, and you didn't tell me any of it. Yes. His voice didn't waver. The accounting was genuine. She'd heard enough evasion in enough high-stress contexts to recognize the alternative when she encountered it. All of that is accurate. All of it is on me. She looked at him for a long moment. What do you need from me? She said. Something shifted in his expression. She thought he'd expected something different, argument, or anger, or a refusal to engage. The directness of the question seemed to require a moment of recalibration. Testimony, he said, sworn, detailed, on the record, what you saw in Carlo, what you heard tonight, your identification of Pruitt as the individual in the conference room 8 years ago. All of it. A pause. It will be used to prosecute Pruitt and to expose the full extent of the reactivation network. It will also... He paused longer. It will also require us to formally acknowledge what Halverson was and what it did to the people who were placed under it. That acknowledgement will be public. How public? As it needs to be credible. She processed this. The response team around them continued their work. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of the facility's main power being restored, the overhead lights brightening from emergency backup to full operational, a shift that felt, after the last hour and a half, almost violent in its normalcy. There's something else, Whitmore said. Tell me. The person who wrote Pruitt's operational brief for tonight, the one who identified you specifically as a secondary target and specified that you should be taken alive. He paused. It wasn't someone in Pruitt's ground organization. The brief was written by someone with access to your complete Halverson file, the classified sections, the sections that only 4 people in the current oversight structure have authorization to access. Mara went still. I am one of those 4 people, Whitmore said. Pruitt, through his program administrator role, had historical access, but that was supposed to have been revoked with the program termination. He looked at her steadily. The other 2 are currently serving Deputy Director of Operations and a Senior Analyst in the Program Records Division. And the brief came from one of them. The metadata on the file access points to the Program Records Division. The analyst. He paused. Her name is Dara Venn. She has been with the Oversight Board for 11 years. She has... Another pause, with a particular quality. She has been present at every significant Halverson-related administrative decision for the past 3 years. Every time a former asset has come to official attention, she has been part of the processing team. She's been managing it from inside, Mara said. She's been managing everything from inside. Pruitt is the operational arm. She is... He stopped. He stopped because his radio had activated. A voice on it, controlled but carrying the specific frequency of urgency that emergency communication always carried regardless of how controlled the speaker was. The words were clear even at the radio's low volume. Deputy Director Whitmore, we have a problem with the Pruitt custody transfer. The vehicle... A pause. The breathing on the other end was wrong. The vehicle transporting the prisoner has been intercepted. Pruitt is no longer in custody. The corridor around them went very quiet. Whitmore's hand tightened on the radio. What is his current location? Unknown. The intercept team used electronic countermeasures and... Another pause with a longer and more alarming quality. And we've lost contact with the analyst on site. Venn. She was present for the custody documentation, and now she's... Static. Then nothing. Whitmore lowered the radio slowly. Mara looked at him, at the ward behind her, at the building around them. Restored power, cleared corridors, the systematic work of a federal response team that had arrived 47 minutes ago, believing it was cleaning up a contained incident. Pruitt is out, she said. Yes, and the person who wrote his operational brief, who has been managing this from inside the Oversight Board for 3 years, is now unaccounted for. She paused. And they both know that the patient downstairs just told me everything. Whitmore's face had shed its careful accounting quality. What was underneath it was the face of a man looking at the full shape of something he'd only seen partially until this moment. They're not done, he said. Mara looked back at Bay 7, at the federal medical team that had custody of a patient who was, according to everything she'd just been told, the only person currently on record who could corroborate her testimony with independent documentation. The only person whose evidence, combined with hers, was sufficient to make the prosecution of Pruitt and Venn airtight rather than defensible. The patient who was lying in a hospital bay with an abdominal injury and a portable IV line and a federal medical team that had just watched its command structure lose communication. "Lock down the ward," she said, moving. "Voss, lock it down now." She was already through the remnants of the ward entrance, already moving down the corridor toward Bay 7 at the particular pace that was faster than a walk and slower than a run and drew less attention than either. "Get every non-essential person out of Ward C. Get your best 2 operators on Bay 7. Get Stroud back up here. Voss, the threat assessment, they will come back for him." She said it over her shoulder, not slowing. "Not Pruitt. He's the operational arm. He'll go to ground. But Venn is the brain. She's been inside this structure for 11 years and she knows exactly how a federal response team organizes a protective custody situation. She knows the protocols. She knows the gap between the initial response and the reinforcement arrival. She knows—" Mara reached the bay entrance and looked in. The federal medical team, the patient on the gurney, the monitors. Everything as she'd left it. And through the window at the far end of Bay 7, the window that looked out over the hospital's east exterior, headlights. A vehicle in the service lane below, dark, not running lights, positioned at an angle that was not parking and not through traffic. Positioned for extraction. She looked at the patient. He was already looking at the window. "How long do we have?" she said. He looked back at her. In his face was the exhaustion of 6 months of trying to get the right information to the right people and watching it fail. And something else. Something that might have been, in different circumstances, the closest thing to confidence. "I think," he said carefully, "that depends entirely on you." From the corridor behind her, she heard Whitmore issuing orders. Lockdown, reinforcement, Stroud's name, Bay 7. The response team moving with renewed urgency. And from the service lane below the window, the vehicle's engine turned over. The engine turned over, and Mara was already moving. Not toward the window, toward the door. The calculation was immediate and did not require deliberation. The vehicle outside was not an assault platform. It was extraction, which meant the assault was coming from inside the building, not from the service lane below. The vehicle was the endpoint of a route that someone had already mapped through Iron Vale's restored corridors, past the response team's current positions, and into Bay 7. The vehicle's engine running was a signal to a team already inside. "We're ready. Move now. Get him off this floor," she said to the federal medical tech closest to the gurney. "Same route as before. Basement, secondary station, now." "We just came up from I know where you came from. Go." The tech looked at his partner, looked at the patient, looked at the door. Made the decision. They started moving the gurney. Mara went to the bay entrance and looked both ways down the corridor. The response team had spread thin. Whitmore's lockdown order had gone out 90 seconds ago, and the operators were repositioning from their post-clearance spread back into a protective configuration, which left the corridor between Ward C and the South Administrative Wing temporarily undercovered. It was a gap of maybe 4 minutes. Someone who knew federal response protocols would know exactly how long that gap lasted and exactly which corridor it affected. Stroud came around the north junction at a controlled run, her weapon already out, the butterfly tape above her eye holding but darkened with fresh blood from the exertion. "Vehicle in the service lane," she said. "I know. It's not the threat. The threat is coming through the administrative connector." Stroud processed this in 1 second. "How many?" "Unknown. Minimum 2. The intercept team that took Pruitt had to have had local support, people already positioned in or near the building before the response team arrived." She looked down the south corridor. Venn wrote the operational brief. She knows this facility's layout because she's been inside the oversight structure long enough to have access to every security diagram Iron Vale ever submitted to federal inspection. She's directing from outside, or she's inside. Mara looked at her. Where was she last confirmed? Stroud's expression changed. Custody documentation, first floor intake, that was a pause with a bad quality to it. 11 minutes ago. 11 minutes. The administrative connector to the second floor was accessible from the first floor intake area. 11 minutes was long enough. "Pull your people back to the freight elevator," Mara said. "Stack on both sides. The gurney goes down. Your two best stay with the patient. Everyone else on the elevator threshold. And you? I'm going to the administrative connector. Voss? Stroud's voice had an edge that wasn't argument. It was the specific edge of a professional watching another professional do something that made tactical sense and personal sense and was going to cost something. You have cracked ribs. I know what I have. You've been in continuous contact for, Stroud. She met the agent's eyes. The patient goes to the basement. You cover him. I need 2 minutes in that connector. A pause that was the length of a real decision. 2 minutes, Stroud said. Then I'm coming in regardless. She went. The administrative connector was a 20-meter corridor joining Ward C's south end to the facility's administrative wing, and it was the kind of institutional space that existed purely for function. No windows, overhead fluorescent, the doors at each end the same reinforced core construction as every other interior door in a federally registered medical facility. In the restored overhead light, it was completely, flatly visible. No shadow, no cover, no geometry that favored concealment on either side, which was why Mara did not go into it. She went to the service panel on the east wall, 12 feet from the connector entrance, and opened it. Inside, the building's secondary power relay for this section of the floor, and beside it, the access hatch for the same horizontal maintenance conduit network that ran through the building's interior walls. Smaller than the vertical utility chase she'd climbed earlier, tight enough that she had to go in sideways, and the ribs made themselves loudly known when she compressed to fit, a bright specific pain that she breathed through and moved past. The conduit ran parallel to the administrative connector. Through the wall between them, she could hear, faintly but clearly enough, footsteps. 2 sets, moving from the administrative wing end toward the Ward C end, measured pace, not rushing because they didn't know the gurney had been moved yet. She moved with them, parallel, tracking their position through the wall by sound, and she counted doors. The connector had 3 interior access points, one to a supply room, one to a records office, one to the small staff lounge that nobody used during night shifts because the coffee machine had been broken for 4 months and nobody had filed the maintenance request. The footsteps stopped. She stopped. 30 seconds of silence, which meant they were listening, which meant they'd heard something. The gurney moving, the elevator, the response team repositioning. The gap in their knowledge was making them careful. A voice. Low, speaking into a radio or a phone. She couldn't make out words, but the cadence was a report. Someone updating someone else on a changed situation. Then the footsteps again, faster now. They'd been told the patient had moved and they were adjusting. She pushed through the conduit to the supply room access, came out through the panel into a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and cardboard, and went to the supply room door and opened it to 4 inches. The connector was visible from this angle. She had a lateral view of approximately 8 meters of it, 2 figures, both in civilian clothes. Dark, non-tactical, the kind of clothing designed to not read as tactical in a facility where a response team was already on alert. One was carrying a medical bag of the type that hospital staff used, which would have gotten them past a cursory check if anyone had been positioned at the connector entrance. The other was empty-handed and walking slightly ahead. Mara looked at the second figure. Female, mid-40s, close-cropped hair, not the same close crop as Stroud's, different, a deliberate professional cut rather than a practical one. Medium height, unremarkable build, the kind of face that had been cultivated over years to be the face that people forgot after meetings. Dara Venn walked with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 11 years being the most knowledgeable person in any room she occupied and had stopped fully accounting for the possibility that this might change. Mara came out of the supply room. She was behind them, 7 meters. She had the weapon up before either of them had registered the door opening. "Stop," she said. Venn stopped. The person with the medical bag stopped. They did not turn around immediately, and the not turning around was itself tactical, buying the fraction of a second needed to assess options from the sound alone before committing to a response. Medical bag. Put it on the floor. The bag went down, slowly, controlled. Turn around. They turned. Venn looked at Mara with an expression that was not fear and not defiance. It was something more specific, the expression of a person recalculating rapidly and not yet landing on a final position. Her eyes went to the weapon, to Mara's face, to the corridor behind Mara, and back. "Nurse Voss," she said, "you wrote the operational brief." Not a question. "You specified that I should be taken alive, that I had operational value." That language was, "Don't." Mara's voice was still level, still the same register it had been all night. "I've been in a building with armed men for the last hour and 40 minutes. I'm not going to be managed." Ven closed her mouth. "You've been inside the oversight board for 11 years. You've been running interference on every piece of Halverson-related intelligence that came through the processing team. And you've been working with Pruitt since—" She paused, and in the pausing ran the timeline she'd just been given and applied it against what she now knew about the Carlo meeting 8 years ago. "Since before the program was officially terminated. You were already working with him when the termination orders were signed." Something moved in Ven's face. Not confirmation exactly, but the absence of denial had a texture of its own. "The termination was your idea," Mara said. It came together as she said it, the logic assembling itself from the pieces she'd been given. "Not because you wanted the program to end, because ending it officially gave you control of the asset files. As the senior analyst on the processing team, you became the primary custodian of every former operator's classified record. Every file, every placement, every person who'd spent months or years embedded in a facility, living a life that was simultaneously real and constructed." She kept the weapon steady. "You've had 11 years of access to those people. Their locations, their identities, their current situations. Pruitt had the operational infrastructure. You had the intelligence. Together—" "You don't understand what the program was," Ven said. Her voice was controlled and had the particular quality of someone who had spent years explaining complex things to people they considered insufficiently equipped to understand them. Halverson was built on the bodies of operators who were placed without adequate oversight, without exit protocols, without any genuine consideration of the human cost. The people running it, Whitmore's predecessors, the original program architects, they didn't think of the assets as people. They were pieces. They were placed and forgotten. And your solution was to keep using them. My solution— She stopped, started again. "My solution was to ensure that the intelligence those assets had accumulated didn't get buried with the program. 11 years of placements, 11 years of observations from inside military and federal facilities. That intelligence had value, enormous value. Value that the official termination was simply going to seal in a classified archive and leave to rot. So you and Pruitt built a private structure to harvest it. We built a structure to ensure it was used." "Used by whom?" Mara said. "Used for what? Because from where I'm standing, what you built is a private intelligence operation running inside a federal oversight body, using former operators who didn't consent to continued use, feeding intelligence to— what? Commercial clients? Foreign partners? People who paid Pruitt's contractor fees?" Ven's jaw tightened. "That's what the patient's testimony covers, isn't it?" Mara said. "Not just the reactivation. The clients. The specific entities that received intelligence harvested from Halverson assets over the past 8 years. That's why you needed him stopped before he testified. Not because he could identify Pruitt, because he could identify where the product went." The person with the medical bag made a small movement. Mara shifted the weapon angle by 2 degrees, which was the entirety of the message required, and the movement stopped. "Where did it go?" Mara said. Ven looked at her with an expression that had moved past calculation into something harder. "You were an exceptional asset," she said. "Your placement in Carlo was the cleanest we had in the program's final period. 14 months without a single security flag. You adapted completely. You built genuine relationships, genuine institutional knowledge. You were but—" A pause. "You were exactly what the program was designed to produce. And then Whitmore signed a piece of paper and you were supposed to become invisible." "I became a nurse," Mara said. "You became a waste," Ven said, and the flatness of it was not cruelty. It was the specific flatness of a person who genuinely believed what they were saying. "Everything you built in Carlo, everything you observed, filed away, inaccessible, unavailable to anyone who might actually use it." "I used it tonight," Mara said. "To keep 43 patients alive." Ven looked at her. "Put your hands behind your head," Mara said. "Both of you." They did. She keyed the radio Whitmore had given her at the ward entrance. Connector corridor. I have Van and one associate. I need 2 people at the ward CN now. Whitmore's voice came back within 5 seconds. En route, 30 seconds. She kept her eyes on Van, and in the 30 seconds that followed, the quiet of the corridor was the loudest thing she'd heard all night. The response team came through the ward C end at a controlled pace. 2 operators, efficient, professional, and the custody of Dara Ven took approximately 45 seconds. The associate with the medical bag turned out to be carrying, inside the bag, equipment consistent with a field sedation kit rather than any legitimate medical purpose. The kind of kit used for subduing a patient who needed to be transported against their will and kept unconscious during transit. The kit was photographed, cataloged, and bagged by an oversight team member who had materialized from somewhere in the administrative wing with the speed and thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for exactly this documentation for a long time. Whitmore arrived 2 minutes after the custody was complete, and he looked at Mara with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. It had elements of relief, elements of something more complicated, elements of a man confronting the full weight of what his administrative failures had set in motion. Ven, he said, looking at the agent now securing her, running it from inside. Pruitt's the operational arm, she's the intelligence architecture. Mara lowered the weapon. Her arms were informing her about the evening in terms she could no longer fully override. The patient's testimony covers the client network. That's the piece that makes the prosecution complete. We'll need yours as well. You have it. He looked at her more carefully. You need medical attention. I need to check on my patients. She started moving toward the ward entrance. Voss. He fell in beside her. Pruitt will surface when his support structure is gone. With Ven in custody and the client network exposed, he has no infrastructure, no protection, and no exit. He'll surface. She kept walking. You have people who handle that. Handle it. What she found in Ward C in the following hour was not a ward that had been through a crisis and come out the other side intact. It was a ward that was damaged in the specific ways that real crises damage things. Not dramatically, not in the ways that made for clean narratives, but in the accumulation of small and specific costs. Kellerman's hip surgery had not appreciated the floor time. He'd done it anyway, had organized 4 patients through a service corridor in the dark without complaint, and was now lying in Bay 3 with a pain level he was reporting as a 6, but which was clearly higher. The physical therapist on morning shift was going to have opinions about the setback to his recovery that he was going to receive with the particular stoicism of a man who'd decided it was worth it. 2 other patients had injuries from the floor contact, one a bruised shoulder, one a more concerning knee that would need imaging. A third had had a monitoring lead disconnected during the chaos, and the resulting gap in his cardiac data was going to require a conversation with his cardiologist that the cardiologist was not going to enjoy having. Halbrook was moving through the ward when Mara arrived, doing the assessment with the methodical focus she'd watched him apply to complex surgical cases. He looked up when she came in. Something in his face had changed since the basement, not softened exactly, recalibrated. The knee in Bay 8 needs a portable X-ray, she said, coming to stand beside him. And Kellerman's hip, I've ordered imaging on both. He paused. Kellerman is claiming a 4. He organized a patient evacuation on a recently repaired hip in the dark. It's not a 4. No. Halbrook looked down at his tablet, then, without looking up, I want to tell you something. She waited. I have been doing this for 30 years, he said. I have worked with nurses who were technically proficient, nurses who were exceptional, nurses who were... He paused. I have never worked with anyone who did what you did tonight. Not in 30 years, not in any context. You held the IV line on a moving gurney through a service corridor in the dark, she said. That wasn't nothing. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man who had encountered an unexpected side of himself and was not entirely sure what to do with it. I owe you a conversation, he said. We have time. She looked at the ward, at the patients, the monitoring equipment, the response team members still present, the overtime staff who'd been called in when the crisis hit and were now doing the work of putting things back in order. After we get through the next 3 hours. He nodded, returned to his assessment. She picked up a patient board and started moving. The next 3 hours were the kind of work she was genuinely good at. Not the other thing, the thing the building had required of her tonight, but this, the inventory of people and their needs. The specific attention that a patient required when they'd been through something frightening and their body had done stress things that their injury or surgical recovery now had to accommodate. The quality of presence that wasn't comfort exactly, but was the thing that people needed when they'd been through something and needed someone to treat them as though they were worth careful attention. She spent 12 minutes with a veteran in Bay 2 who'd been directly across from one of the tactical contacts and had watched it happen from his bed, and who was now dealing with the particular aftermath of having been a helpless witness to violence. She didn't perform comfort at him. She checked his lines, asked him factual questions about his pain and his overnight intake, and when he stopped answering questions and simply looked at her, she sat on the edge of the chair beside his bed and let him look until the looking became something less sharp. "You work here," he said finally. "You're actually a nurse." "Yes." "But you also—" He stopped. "I work here," she said again. "This is my ward." He considered this, nodded slowly. She moved on. Marshal Daines was still in the external corridor, his leg wound now properly treated by the response team's medical element, his color better than it had been when she'd left him at the elevator bank. He stopped her as she passed. "Your people told me what happened in the connector," he said. She didn't know who her people were exactly, but she let it go. "Venn in custody," he said. "Pruitt still out." "Yes." "For what it's worth," he paused, "I've been doing federal protection work for 14 years. What you managed in this building tonight, with what you had—" He shook his head. "I've worked with special operations people who couldn't have done it." "You held your position with a leg wound," she said, "with no backup and no communication. That's not nothing either." He looked at her with the direct measuring quality of a professional evaluating another professional and arriving at a conclusion. "Whatever you were before you were a nurse," he said carefully, "I hope they're putting it on the right paperwork." She thought about the right paperwork, about Whitmore and his Intelligence Oversight Board and his sworn testimony requirements and his 11-year-old administrative failure and his genuine costly accounting for it. About the debrief that was going to happen, probably tomorrow, probably in a room with recording equipment and people she'd never met, and questions that were going to cover territory she'd spent 8 years not thinking about. "They will," she said, and meant it as a statement of intent rather than a prediction. The response team began their withdrawal from the facility at 4:15 a.m. Not all of them, but the tactical element, replaced by a smaller federal protective detail that would stay with the patient until he was transferred to a secure medical facility at a location she wasn't told and didn't ask about. The administrative oversight people stayed. The documentation people stayed. The facility's own administrative staff began arriving for the early shift and were being met by a situation that the on-call PR coordinator for Iron Vale Medical Center was going to spend the next several days trying to characterize for the outside world. Stroud found Mara at the nurses' station at 4:30, doing the documentation that the night's events had generated. Injury logs, incident reports, the specific administrative paper trail that a facility incident of this scope required. The federal documentation would be handled elsewhere, but the medical record of what had happened to the patients in Ward C was her responsibility, and she was doing it with the same focused attention she applied to everything. "The patient is being transferred in the next hour," Stroud said. "Secure facility. His testimony is going to be formally recorded with IG oversight tomorrow." "Good. Yours will be scheduled pending your medical clearance." A pause. "You need imaging on those ribs." "I'll get it when the shift ends." Stroud sat down in the chair next to the station. She sat the way people sat when the adrenaline had finally cleared the system and the body was making its accounting known. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Off the record." Mara looked up from the documentation. "When they briefed us on the response call," Stroud said, "we were told we had a critical federal asset in a compromised facility with a breached security team and an unknown number of armed hostiles. We were told to expect an active scene and minimal survivor cooperation." She paused. "When we came in and found what we found," she stopped. One nurse had managed the ground team, protected the asset, identified the internal source, tracked the command element, and secured the primary evidence subject. In approximately 90 minutes, with cracked ribs and a weapon she'd taken from one of the hostiles. Another pause. My team lead has 16 years with the Protective Service. He said he'd never written an incident report where the word nurse appeared in that many unexpected positions. Tell him to write it accurately, Mara said. All of it. He will. Stroud stood. For whatever it's worth. I'll be making sure of that personally. She left. At 5:10 a.m., Whitmore returned to the ward. He came alone, which told her the conversation was going to be personal rather than administrative, and he sat in the chair that Stroud had vacated and looked at her with the face of a man who still had things to say. Pruitt was apprehended at 4:52 a.m., he said. Highway patrol stop, 40 miles east of Ironvale. The vehicle that intercepted his custody transfer was tracked by a satellite asset we'd repositioned during the lockdown. He paused. He's currently in federal custody at a different location. He will not have access to counsel until the IG office has completed its preliminary interview. She absorbed this without expression. The client network documentation is being processed, he continued. The patient's 6 months of surveillance data, combined with Ven's system access logs, which we are now pulling in their entirety, gives us a complete picture of who received what and when. A pause. There were 9 clients, 2 domestic, 7 foreign. None of them are going to have a comfortable few months. The people they received intelligence about, she said, former assets, will be formally notified, by me, personally, as the current senior official with oversight responsibility for the program. His voice carried the weight of that commitment. Every one of them. Their records will be unsealed for their own review. Whatever decisions they want to make from there, whether to testify, whether to pursue accountability through civil channels, whether to simply know the truth about what happened to them, those decisions will be theirs. Mara looked at him. I know that doesn't... He stopped. I know that doesn't undo the placement, or the years without disclosure, or tonight. No, she said, it doesn't. Is there anything you want from me? Right now, before the formal process begins. She thought about this seriously. Not what she was supposed to want, not what the situation conventionally produced as an answer, what she actually wanted. I want accurate records, she said. My file at Ironvale says I have a standard military medical background. I want it to reflect what my actual background is. Not classified, not sealed, accurate. So that if I make a clinical decision or a tactical decision in a situation like tonight, the people around me understand why. Whitmore nodded slowly. And I want the ward patients' incident reports reviewed by the IG office. Every injury they sustained tonight as a result of the breach. I want it formally documented as a consequence of the failure in the Halverson shutdown process, because they were in that position because of a program that wasn't properly terminated 8 years ago. She met his eyes. They deserve to have that on record. It will be, he said. I give you my word. She looked at him steadily. The word of a deputy director who had failed to properly close a program and trusted people he shouldn't have and moved an asset without consent. It was a word with limitations, but it was being offered with the specific gravity of someone who had already begun paying for past failures and intended to continue. Okay, she said. He stood, paused in the edge of the station. For what it's worth, Voss, what you did here tonight, all of it. I've been in this work for 30 years and I have... He stopped, seemed to decide that the ending he'd prepared wasn't right, started again. You'll be heard, he said simply. Going forward, whatever you say, whatever you decide, you will be heard. He left. At 5:45 a.m., with the ward quieted and the documentation largely complete, and the early shift beginning to arrive in the particular daily renewal that hospitals always performed regardless of what the night had held, Kellerman called her to Bay 3. She went and stood at the foot of his bed and looked at him. Your hip, she said. It's fine. It was not fine. Listen, I've been lying here for the last hour putting it together. He looked at her with the direct, stripped-down quality he'd had in the corridor during the evacuation. All the ward social director friendliness gone, just the staff sergeant underneath it. I was wrong about you. You didn't know me. I made assumptions. His jaw tightened. You came in here and I looked at you and I decided what you were. Rookie nurse, not tough enough for this ward, probably wouldn't last 3 months. He paused. I called you names to people, behind your back, nothing vicious, just Dismissive. The kind of thing that's easy to do when you've decided someone doesn't belong. She looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. That's a real apology, not a courtesy one. She thought about the 6 weeks on this ward, the jokes she'd let go, the assessments she'd absorbed without responding to. The way she'd simply done her job and let the dismissal exist around her because engaging with it was less important than doing the work. "I know," she said. "You're the best." He stopped. Started again. "In 14 years of military service, I've been in situations. I've served with people who were exceptional under pressure." He met her eyes directly. "You belong here. In this ward, you're the best person in it." A pause. "I just wanted you to know, I know that." She stood with it for a moment. "Your physical therapy starts at 7, she said. "You need 200 milligrams of ibuprofen and you need to eat something before they start working on that hip." She pulled the blanket back over his feet where it had slipped. "I'll make sure the kitchen sends something up." He watched her. "Yes, Nurse Voss," he said. And this time it was exactly what she'd wanted it to be all along, just what it said. Nothing more, nothing less. She was at the nursing station at 6:15, finishing the last of the documentation, when the overnight security supervisor came through the ward entrance with an expression that made her look up before he'd said anything. "What?" she said. "The vehicle from the service lane," he said. "The one that was outside the east window during the incident." He looked down at his tablet. "We ran the plates when we secured the perimeter." "And? The vehicle is registered to a shell company. We're still working back through the chain, but the first layer resolves to a management holding entity that—" He stopped, looked at his tablet again, and she could see him checking the information one more time before saying it. "That is documented business relationships with the Intelligence Oversight Board. Specifically," he met her eyes, "specifically with a budget allocation that runs through the Program Records Division. Ven's operational budget. Ven's vehicle, or a vehicle sourced through her network. Not Pruitt's people. Ven's people." Mara set down the documentation. "Who else knows this?" she said. "Right now? Me and you." She thought about the response team withdrawal at 4:15, the smaller federal protective detail that had replaced them. The single agent currently stationed outside the patient's room, the patient who was still in this facility, not yet transferred, his transfer scheduled for within the next hour. She thought about Ven in federal custody, about the 11 years Ven had spent inside the oversight structure, about the number of shell companies a person could establish in 11 years with access to federal budget channels and a private intelligence client network. "How many people does a custody hold require?" she said. "Standard federal? 2 agents on site plus a transport team." "Is the transport team here yet?" He checked. His face told her the answer before he spoke it. "Transport is delayed," he said. 20 minutes out." 20 minutes. A patient in a room at the end of Ward C with 2 agents on his door and a transfer that was 20 minutes from arriving. A shell company vehicle that had been in the service lane for the duration of the incident. A network that had 11 years of infrastructure and had just watched 2 of its principals go into federal custody. She was already moving when the first agent's radio outside the patient's room cut to static. The radio cut to static and Mara was already through the ward entrance before the security supervisor had finished processing what he'd just told her. The corridor outside the patient's room was 12 meters from the ward entrance. She covered it in 8 seconds and found exactly what the static had suggested she would find. 1 agent down against the wall, conscious but moving wrong. His hand pressed to his neck where a fast-acting sedative of some kind had gone in. The second agent was not visible. The door to the patient's room was ajar by 4 inches, which was 4 inches more than it should have been. She went through it low and fast, the way the utility chase had taught her to move through tight entries, and came up inside a room that had been rearranged by the few seconds of chaos preceding her arrival. The second agent was on the floor near the window, also conscious, also compromised. The same contact sedation, she guessed, delivered by someone who'd been inside the room when the agents made their check, which meant the room had been breached before the radio cut. The radio cut being a distraction rather than a signal. The patient was sitting up in his bed. Beside him, with one hand on the portable IV line and the other holding a device that Mara recognized as a compact signal jammer of the type that would have accounted for both the radio static and the monitoring equipment now reading flatline on its display, stood a woman she'd never seen before. 50s. Compact. the kind of face that suggested decades of careful plainness. She was not Ven. Ven was in federal custody on the floor below. This was someone else. Someone Ven's network had positioned here before Ven herself had been taken, which meant the network had anticipated the arrest and had this contingency in place before the night began. The woman looked at Mara without surprise. "The nurse?" she said. Her voice was accented, something Northern European, slight, the kind that fluency in English had almost entirely covered. "We've been hearing about you for the last 2 hours. Step away from the patient," Mara said. "If I interrupt this IV line..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The device in her hand had been inserted into the IV port, which meant whatever was in it would enter the patient's bloodstream the moment she activated it. Not a sedative. Something with a faster and more permanent result. Mara looked at the device, at the IV line, at the patient. He was looking at her with the same evaluating steadiness he'd maintained since the gurney in the emergency intake, and in his face was something she read as, "I know exactly what she has. I know exactly what it will do. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at the woman. "What do you want?" she said. "The documentation, the surveillance data he collected, the 6 months of communication logs." The woman's voice was professional and without heat. "He knows where the physical copies are stored. I want the location." "And then?" "And then I leave." A pause. "And then he lives." The monitoring equipment was flatlined and the radio was dead, and the 2 agents on the floor were incapacitated, and the transport team was still 15 minutes from the facility, and Whitmore was somewhere in the administrative wing a floor away, and the response team had departed 40 minutes ago. Mara did the math quickly and comprehensively, the way she'd been doing math in this building since the lights went out, and the math arrived at the same answer it had been arriving at all night. The only available resource was the one she'd been working with the entire time. She lowered the weapon slightly, not fully. A partial lower, the specific body language of someone in the process of making a decision. The woman's eyes tracked the movement. "The documentation is digital," the patient said quietly. His voice was calm in a way that required significant effort to produce, and Mara could hear the effort. "Encrypted, distributed across multiple servers. The decryption key is compartmentalized. No single location holds everything." "You're the key," the woman said. "Your authentication, your biometric." "Yes." "Then you understand the situation." "I understand the situation clearly," the patient said. He looked at Mara. "She needs me alive and cooperative. The moment she has what she needs, the assessment changes." "I know," Mara said. "So whatever you're..." "I know," she said again, and in the 2 seconds of his processing that, she moved, not toward the woman, away, backward, to the left, to the crash cart against the wall that she'd positioned in her mental inventory of this room during the earlier assessment before the patient was transferred to federal medical custody. The defibrillator on the cart was charged. She'd checked it at 5 a.m. as part of the routine ward assessment because checking crash carts was something she did on schedule regardless of everything else happening around her. The defibrillator paddles carried enough electrical charge to interrupt a cardiac rhythm. They also carried enough to interrupt a compact signal jammer if the paddles were applied to the metal housing at the right discharge level. She grabbed the paddles and discharged them into the jammer housing in the woman's hand before the woman had fully processed that Mara had moved away from rather than toward her. The discharge was not clean. It jumped across the woman's hand and the jammer both, and the woman went down hard. Not cardiac arrest, the charge wasn't directed at her chest, but the involuntary muscle response from the current through her hand took her to the floor with a force that was not gentle. The jammer housing cracked and went dark. The monitoring equipment on the wall rebooted immediately, the flatline replaced by the patient's actual cardiac rhythm, fast, stressed, but present. The radio on the downed agent near the window crackled back to life with Whitmore's voice cutting through it, already mid-sentence, already alarmed. Mara set the paddles down. Her hands were not steady. She looked at them for 1 second, noted this, and made a deliberate decision to acknowledge it rather than override it. She'd been in this building for 7 hours and 40 minutes. She was running on a deficit that couldn't be indefinitely managed. She keyed the agent's radio. "Room secure. I need medical support and additional personnel at the patient's room, Ward C, now." The woman on the floor was conscious, barely, her hand curled against her chest from the involuntary contraction. She was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose body had just done something without asking permission and was reassembling the pieces. The patient looked at Mara. "That was," he started. "Don't say it was impressive," she said. "It was the only option, and it was rough, and she's going to have nerve damage in that hand for weeks." A pause. "I was going to say it was the right call," he said. She looked at him, at the monitoring equipment showing his rhythm, at the IV line now intact and no longer compromised, at the room around them which was damaged and disarranged and functional. "It was a call," she said. "Whether it was right is for other people to determine." He watched her with those steady, dark eyes. "You know what the testimony is going to do. When it comes out fully, the client list, the network, the former assets, and what was done to them without their knowledge." A pause. "It is going to be uncomfortable for a significant number of people in significant positions." "I know." "And you're still going to give it?" "Yes." "Why?" Not challenging, genuine. She thought about the question, about the honest answer rather than the convenient one. "Because the people in those files, the former assets, the ones who were placed and not told, and who built lives thinking they were out, they deserve to have what happened to them acknowledged, not classified, not managed." "Oh, shitas." She paused. "And because the patients in this ward spent an hour on their floors tonight, because a program that should have been closed 8 years ago wasn't, that has to be on the record." He nodded slowly. Then, "And your own placement, what Whitmore did, also on the record. Even though he's cooperating. Cooperation doesn't erase it. It factors into the accounting, but it doesn't replace the accounting." She looked at him steadily. "I was moved without my consent into a position I didn't know was operational. That happened. It's going to be said clearly." The door opened, and Whitmore came through it with 2 response team members who had apparently been recalled, and behind them the facility's own security supervisor, and behind him, somewhat unexpectedly, Stroud, who had apparently not left when Mara thought she had, but had remained somewhere in the building, finishing documentation or finishing something else, and who looked at the scene in the room with the expression of a person doing a rapid assessment and landing on contained. Whitmore looked at the woman on the floor, at the cracked jammer, at Mara. "The transport is 8 minutes out," he said. "I know. Are you—" "I need imaging on my ribs," she said, "and the 2 agents outside need full medical workup for contact sedation exposure. I don't know the compound, but the response looked like a cholinesterase inhibitor variant. They'll need atropine if their symptoms progress past current presentation." She looked at Stroud. "Can you stay with him until the transport arrives?" "Yes," Stroud said, no hesitation. "Mara." The patient's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was sitting fully upright now, which his abdominal injury objected to and which he was overriding with the same effortful calm he'd maintained all night. "When this is over, the testimony, the prosecutions, the formal process, there are going to be decisions made about the former assets, how they're acknowledged, what they're offered, what their options are." A pause. "Your input in that process matters. Your experience of it matters. Don't let them manage you out of the conversation." She looked at him. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I'll be in this ward." "Yes," he said, "and you should be. But when they ask, and they will ask, don't give them a small answer." She held that for a moment. Then she went to check on her patients. The imaging confirmed 2 cracked ribs and a bruised third, which Halbrook reviewed personally with the expression of a man fulfilling a commitment he'd made to himself in a basement 4 hours ago. He said nothing while he reviewed the scans. Then he said, "You need 7 to 10 days of restricted activity. I have patients. You have staff who can cover. I have patients who—" "Voss?" He looked at her directly. Not the old look. Not the look that had evaluated her and found her insufficient. The look of a colleague making a clinical judgment. "You have cracked ribs, 7 to 10 days. You can be in the building. You cannot be doing physical patient care at full load." A pause. "This is not negotiable on medical grounds." She held his gaze. 5 days, she said. 7. 6. He looked at her for a long moment. 6, he said. and she thought she saw something at the edge of his expression that in another person she might have called amusement. "You're a difficult patient." "I've been told." He closed the imaging folder. "The conversation I owe you," he said, "about the things I said when you came to this ward." He paused. "I was wrong. Not just about tonight. I was wrong about the way I spoke to you, the way I spoke about you, the assumptions I made and enforced." He met her eyes. "I run this ward badly in some respects. I'm excellent at the surgery and poor at the part where I'm responsible for the professional environment the people around me work in. I have known this for a long time and done inadequate things about it." Another pause, longer. "I'm going to do something about it, starting with an apology to every nurse on this ward for the specific things I've said and done." His jaw tightened in the way of a person doing something that costs them. "And I'm asking you, if you're willing, to help me understand what that looks like in practice, what changes look like. Because I've operated for 30 years on the assumption that my medical skill was sufficient justification for my behavior, and tonight I saw what professional excellence without arrogance actually looks like, and He stopped. "I would like to be better." It was the most words she'd heard Holbrook string together without a scalpel in his hand or a resident to instruct, and they were said with the specific difficulty of someone using muscles they hadn't developed. "Yes," she said simply. He nodded, looked almost relieved. "Okay." "And Holbrook." She met his eyes. "The IV management on the moving gurney in the service corridor. I've worked with experienced nurses who couldn't have done that without losing the line. You need to know that." He absorbed this without performing humility, just took it as the factual statement it was. "Thank you," he said. The patient's transport arrived at 7:14 a.m., and Mara watched it from the window at the end of Ward C's main corridor. A secure medical vehicle with federal escort positioned at the facility's primary entrance rather than the service lane, in the full morning light that had arrived sometime in the last hour, and now made everything look different than the night had made it look. Sharper. More like itself. Stroud accompanied the transport and paused at the vehicle to look back at the building. When her eyes found the window where Mara was standing, she gave a single nod. Not a wave, not a salute, just the nod of one professional to another across a distance. Mara returned it. The vehicle pulled out. In the days that followed, the building's visible wounds were addressed faster than its institutional ones. The breached ward entrance was repaired within 48 hours. New frame, new panel, the damage erased with the efficiency that facilities applied to visible damage, because visible damage alarmed patients and families, and was bad for the particular version of confidence that medical institutions depended on. The damage to the ward's patients took longer. The veteran in Bay 2 had 2 sessions with the facility's trauma counselor before he started sleeping through the night again. Kellerman's hip recovery was set back by 3 weeks, which he accepted with a matter-of-factness that didn't fully cover how much it cost him. The patient with the knee injury needed a brace and a revised recovery timeline. All of it was documented, not just in medical records, but in the IG report that Whitmore's office submitted formally 6 days after the incident, which was the first time the formal record acknowledged that patient injuries had occurred as a direct consequence of the Halverson program's improper termination. That report was 47 pages long. Mara's name appeared in it 23 times, all in factual descriptive contexts. None of them the context her Iron Veil personnel file would have predicted 6 weeks ago. The testimony was scheduled for 9 days after the incident. A conference room at a federal building in the nearest city, oversight board members, IG staff, a court reporter, and recording equipment. Mara sat across from people who had files in front of them and asked questions for 4 hours, and she answered every question with the same level, precise register she used for everything. And when they asked about Carlo, she told them what she'd seen in that conference room with the detail and the clarity of a person who had learned early that memory was only useful if it was accurate and had spent years maintaining that accuracy. When she identified Pruitt as the third person in the conference room, the IG lead put down his pen and looked at her for 3 seconds before writing anything down. Denton's cooperation with federal investigators was complete and early enough to factor into his charging recommendations. He pleaded to a reduced charge of facilitating unauthorized intelligence disclosure, which carried a sentence that was not light, but was not the maximum. He lost his nursing administrator certification and his position at Ironvale. 20 years ended in a morning, which was not a satisfying outcome and was not supposed to be. It was simply the shape of what happened when a person made choices, and the choices had consequences. And the gap between what he had been and what he became was something he would have to carry without anyone making it comfortable for him. Pruitt's prosecution was federal, multi-count, and included charges related to unauthorized intelligence operation, conspiracy, the deaths of the 2 federal agents killed in the initial breach, and 17 additional counts that covered 8 years of the network's activity. The trial would take 2 years to complete. His legal team was excellent, and it didn't matter because the documentation was airtight. 6 months of the patient's surveillance, Ven's system access logs. The client network records that 7 separate federal agencies spent 4 months untangling, and the testimony of a former classified embed who had placed him at the origin point of the entire operation 8 years ago. Ven was charged separately, on a count schedule that was longer than Pruitt's, because her 11 years inside the oversight structure had given her 11 years of opportunities, and she had used all of them. Her legal team argued that the original Halverson program's ethical failures were mitigating, that she had acted in a context of institutional wrongdoing. The IG's office noted, in its formal response to this argument, that an institutional wrong did not create a personal right to compound it with a private intelligence network that had fed classified information to foreign clients for 8 years. The argument did not go well for Ven. She was convicted on 31 counts. The sentencing was public. When the number was read into the courtroom record, Mara was not present. She was in Ward C, doing the work of a Tuesday morning, checking patient lines and updating boards and making sure the veteran in Bay 2 had eaten breakfast because he still had trouble remembering to do that when his sleep had been bad. She heard about the sentencing from Stroud, who called her that afternoon. "It's done," Stroud said. "I know. You should have been there." "I was here," Mara said. "This is where I needed to be." A pause. "How are the ribs?" "Better." "The ward?" "Also better." Another pause with a different quality. "The IG office is going to issue a formal public statement about the Halverson program next week. Former asset notification is going out in the same window. All of them." A pause. "Whitmore is personally signing every letter." "Good." "Mara." Stroud's voice had shifted to something more direct. "He's also recommending a formal commendation for your actions during the incident. Not internal, public. It's going to go through the Military Medical Command Structure and the Federal Oversight Board jointly." Mara sat with this for a moment. "It doesn't need to be public," she said. "It does," Stroud said, "for exactly the same reason the program acknowledgement needs to be public. Because things that happen in the dark only stop happening in the dark when someone puts them in the light." A pause. "You know this." She did. "Okay," she said. The commendation was issued on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the incident, in a document that ran to 2 pages and covered the specific details of what had happened in Ironvale Medical Center on the night of the breach with a precision that left nothing general or vague. Every patient who had been protected, every decision that had been made, every action taken in a building with no power, limited resources, and sustained threat. At the end of the document, where formal commendations typically included a brief description of the individual's capacity, someone in the IG's office had written, "Nurse, operator, both fully, neither a compromise of the other." Whitmore hand-delivered a copy to Ironvale, which was unusual protocol for a document of its type. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and found Mara in Ward C and sat in the chair beside the nursing station, the same chair Stroud had used, the same chair he himself had used, and put the document on the station surface without ceremony. She read it. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the ward around her. "There's something else," Whitmore said. "The Oversight Board is establishing a formal review panel for the Halverson shutdown process. Independent. It will have subpoena authority over all records and all individuals with connection to the program." He paused. "I've been asked to recommend a civilian co-chair. Someone outside the intelligence structure who has direct personal experience of the program's impact and the professional background to evaluate the medical and institutional dimensions of the review." He looked at her steadily. "I'm recommending you." She looked at him. "I'm a ward nurse," she said. "You're also a former classified embed with first-hand knowledge of the program's placement practices. the specific experience of the Iron Veil incident, medical professional expertise that is directly relevant to the review's scope, and, he paused, you're the person who held this building together on the worst night it's ever had, while the rest of us were either compromised, arriving late, or standing in corridors being accountable for past failures. He held her gaze. The panel meets quarterly. The work is serious but bounded. It does not require you to leave this ward. Most servants. She looked at the ward, at the patients, at the morning light through the window at the end of the corridor, the same window where she'd watched the transport vehicle pull away 3 weeks ago. The same window through which the Nevada morning came in with the specific flat clarity of desert light that didn't soften anything but made it all very visible. She thought about the patient's words. Don't give them a small answer. I'll need the review schedule in writing, she said, and a formal guarantee that the panel's findings are public, not classified, not sealed. Yes, Whitmore said, and I want the medical impact assessment, what happened to the patients in this ward that night, to be formally included in the panel's scope, not as a footnote. It will be the first item, he said. She looked at the commendation document on the station surface. Okay, she said. Kellerman was discharged 4 days later, cleared after the extended recovery that the evacuation had cost him. He came to the nursing station on his way out, moving carefully with the gait of someone who was functional and working not to show how much work functional currently required. He stopped in front of her. He'd brought coffee, 2 cups from the cart in the main lobby, the decent kind rather than the machine down the hall that nobody trusted. He set one on the station surface and held the other. I heard about the panel, he said. Word travels. In this ward, word travels at about the speed of light. He paused. You're going to be good at it. I'm going to be honest about it, she said. Whether that's good is someone else's call. He smiled. It was a different smile than the one he'd used in the first weeks. Not the social director smile, not the friendly but measuring smile. Simpler than those, more direct. Same thing, he said. In my experience. She picked up the coffee. Take care of that hip, she said. Yes, nurse, he said, and walked out. The ward went on around her, the monitors hummed. The early afternoon shift was beginning to settle into its rhythms. The pace of a military medical ward on a Thursday, the particular cadences of people doing serious work without drama about the fact that it was serious. A patient called from Bay 4 for a medication check. A resident appeared at the station with a question about a discharge protocol that was actually about the discharge protocol, but also about the resident being 26 and genuinely uncertain and needing confirmation from someone who wasn't going to make them feel small for asking. She answered the question fully and without condescension, and watched the resident's face do the thing that faces did when they'd been treated as capable of understanding the complete answer rather than a managed version of it. Halbrook passed the station late in the afternoon and paused long enough to look at the board and then at her. Bay 2's cardiac output is trending better, he said. I saw that this morning. The physical therapy notes on Kellerman. He stopped. He's gone. Discharged this afternoon. He nodded. A pause that had the quality of something that was going to be said working its way to the surface. The staff meeting I called for next week, he said. The nursing staff. I know about it. I'd like you to be there, not to manage me, not to... He stopped. Tried again. I'd like you to hear it, what I say, and tell me afterward if it was right. She looked at him. I'll be there, she said. He walked on. She looked at the ward for a moment, the full length of it, the bays and the monitoring equipment and the afternoon light coming through the windows, the staff moving in their routines, the particular living quality of a place where people were in the process of being repaired, and not all of them would make it back to where they'd been, and some of them would make it further than that. She thought about the night that had happened in this space, the weight of it, the cost of it, the things it had required, the climbing through dark utility chases with cracked ribs, the corridor math, the people on floors they shouldn't have been on because a program that should have been dead was still moving in the dark, using people like pieces, operating on the assumption that nobody would ever look closely enough at the quiet blonde nurse near the supply cart to understand what they were actually looking at. She thought about being wrong about that assumption, about what it had cost and what it had changed. The thing about being underestimated, the real thing, the thing that didn't resolve into a clean lesson, was that it was never just a single moment. It was the accumulation of moments, the daily low-level erosion of being seen as less than you were. And the question it eventually asked was, do you let it change what you are? Or do you do the work regardless of whether anyone around you has correctly appraised the person doing it? She had chosen the work. For 6 weeks in this ward, for 14 months in Carlo, for 8 years of building a life that was genuinely hers, genuinely good, genuinely worth having, regardless of what anyone in a classified program thought about the asset value of a nurse who'd moved on. The work had mattered before anyone confirmed it mattered. That was the part that people got backwards. They thought the recognition changed the value of what had been done. It didn't. The recognition just made it visible. The value was always there, in the doing, in the choosing, in the showing up to a night shift in a military medical ward with a cold gas station coffee and a willingness to do the job completely, regardless of who was paying attention. She picked up a patient board. A nurse named Reyes appeared beside her, new to the ward, 3 weeks in, and showing the particular watchfulness of someone trying to calibrate expectations in an unfamiliar environment. Reyes had been one of the night staff during the incident and had managed the non-evacuated patients through the crisis with a steadiness that Mara had noted and not yet formally said anything about. Dr. Halbrook's meeting next week, Reyes said carefully. Do you know what it's about? Yes. A pause. Should I be worried? Mara looked at her, at the question beneath the question, which was, is this ward a place where I will be treated as capable, or is it a place where I will be managed and dismissed and told to lower my expectations of what I'm allowed to be here? No, she said. You shouldn't be worried. She paused. This ward is changing. What happens here is going to match the people who are here. She met Reyes's eyes. You're good. You were good under pressure when good under pressure was what the situation required. That's going to be seen here, going forward. Reyes held the eye contact for a moment, taking it in. Okay, she said. Base 6 needs a line check, Mara said. The secondary port has been giving intermittent readings. On it, Reyes said, and went. Mara looked at the board in her hands, at the names on it, at the work ahead. She had cracked ribs, and a testimony on record, and a panel co-chairship that was going to require her to sit in rooms with people who found accountability uncomfortable and tell them clearly what comfort was not available to them. She had a ward that was imperfect and damaged, and in the process of becoming something better than it had been. She had 6 weeks of dismissal behind her and a long night ahead of her in memory, and a commendation on the station surface that she would read once more, carefully, and then file and not look at again, because it said what happened, and what happened was fixed now, a record, and the next thing was ahead. She was 31 years old. She was a nurse. She was other things, too, and those things were now on the right paperwork, and the people who needed to know them knew them. And the people who had tried to use those things without her knowledge or consent were sitting in federal custody accounting for that choice in the specific, consequential, permanent way that courts required. She walked to Bay 2 and checked on the veteran who still had trouble remembering to eat breakfast on bad sleep nights, and he was awake and the tray was mostly empty and his cardiac output was trending better. And when she adjusted his pillow and asked him his pain level, he said 4, and she believed him this time. Heard you're staying, he said. I work here. Heard you might not, after everything. He paused. Heard they offered you things. They offered me things I can do from here, she said. He looked at her with the direct simplicity of a person who had been through enough to have run out of patience for anything indirect. Good, he said. This ward needs you. She straightened his blanket. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the Nevada afternoon was going toward evening, and the light was doing what desert light did at that hour, going gold and long-shadowed, making everything it touched look like it had been there forever and would continue to be. The building around her was repaired and functioning and carrying the weight of what had happened inside it, without that weight being visible from the outside, which was how institutions worked and always had. Inside it, though, in the specific human architecture of the people who moved through its corridors and worked its equipment and sat with its patients at 2 a.m. when the bad hours arrived. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way that got clean narratives, but in the way that real changes happened, slowly, specifically, in the daily choices of people who had seen something and decided to be different about it. Halbrook, who was going to stand in front of his nursing staff next week and say something that would cost him. Reyes, who was going to learn that this ward was a place she was allowed to be fully herself. Kellerman, who was going to walk back into whatever came next with a recalibrated understanding of what the word capable actually described. And Mara Voss, who was going to file the paperwork, check the lines, do the panel work, give the testimony its full and unsparing account, and come back to this ward every shift and do the things she had chosen and was good at and would continue to choose. Not because anyone was watching, not because the commendation was on the station surface, not because the night had made her visible in ways that 6 weeks of good work hadn't, because the work was worth doing. Because the people in these beds were worth the full quality of attention she could give them. Because she had learned, over years of operating in the dark, literally and otherwise, that the value of what you did had never depended on whether anyone correctly understood who was doing it. She had always known who she was. The rest of it was just the world catching up. She picked up the next board and walked into the ward and went to work.